The sea has always whispered to humankind. Long before maps were drawn or compasses turned, people stood upon rocky shores and gazed outward, wondering what lay beyond the mist. In the far north of Europe, where the land stretches into fjords and forests, where winters linger and summers shine briefly, there lived a people who listened to that whisper more intently than most. We call them the Vikings, but in this telling, there will be no clashing of swords, no loud sagas of conquest, no sudden rage shouted across coasts. Instead, we will let the waves quiet us. We will travel slowly, in imagination, with the longships. As they glide upon waters calm and misty, we will drift into villages where smoke rises from turf-roof halls, where sheep graze upon narrow pastures, where axes echo softly in the forest as timbers are shaped into the ribs of ships. We will hear the creak of oars, the snap of sails catching wind, the hush of the tide against the hull. The Vikings are remembered as raiders, yet they were also farmers, craftsmen, poets, and wanderers. They were men and women of rhythm, of season and sea, of harvest and voyage. Their world was not only violence but endurance, not only fire but frost, not only battle but story. Tonight, as we drift into their history, we will find calmness in their slowness, patience in their journeys, and quiet wonder in the way they touched both land and ocean. The title of this series, The Vikings, Slow Voyages Across Misty Seas, a guide. We will not hurry. We will let the oars dip steadily, one stroke at a time. We will breathe with the wind that fills the sails. We will watch the coastline fade into mist, as countless voyagers once did, setting out from familiar fjords into the unknown. This is boring history for sleep, yet boring not because it is empty, but because it is steady. It carries us into a rhythm, into detail, into patience. It is meant to be listened to not with the sharp ear of study, but with the quiet ear of dreaming. If you drift into slumber while hearing of these voyages, then you are doing just as you should. Close your eyes, breathe softly. The longship waits at the shore. The journey begins. In the beginning, before sails were raised and horizons crossed, there were the homelands, the long, rugged shores of Scandinavia. This region, today divided into Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was the cradle of Viking life. It was not a land of easy abundance, nor of gentle climates, but it was a land that shaped strong people, accustomed to patience and endurance. The geography of these northern lands is striking. Norway is a place of fjords, narrow inlets of sea cutting deep into the land, their sides steep with cliffs and forests. Here villages clung to the water's edge, small and scattered, with houses built of timber and roofed with turf or thatch. Sweden, broader and filled with forests and lakes, offered timber, iron, and hunting grounds. Denmark, lower and flatter, lay closer to the continent, its soil more fertile, its coasts open to trade across the Baltic. Together, these lands formed the roots of a people who would one day sail far beyond their home. Daily life was shaped by the seasons. In summer, the sun lingered long in the sky, shining almost without setting in the far north. Fields of barley and rye ripened, sheep and cattle grazed on mountain pastures, and fish filled nets cast into the sea. Families gathered hay, mended houses, carved tools, and prepared for the long months ahead. In winter, darkness ruled. Snow blanketed the hills, rivers froze, and life retreated inward, into the warm halls where fire crackled in central hearths. Men and women passed the time by telling stories, singing songs, carving wood, and weaving cloth. Survival was not simple, but it was steady, marked by rhythm and repetition. The houses were modest but warm. Longhouses, often shared by extended families, held hearths at their center. Smoke rose through vents in the roof, carrying with it the smell of peat or wood. Benches lined the sides, where people slept beneath firs. At one end, animals might be sheltered in winter, their breath warming the air. At the other, tools and goods were stored. These were not palaces, but they were homes, built strong enough to endure storms and snow, yet flexible enough to be mended when needed. Work was constant, but varied. Farmers tended their fields. Women wove with looms. Children herded animals. Elders told tales. Blacksmiths forged iron into tools and weapons, their hammers ringing softly in villages that seemed otherwise quiet. Carpenters shaped timber into plows, wagons, and most importantly, ships. Without ships, the Viking world would have remained small. With ships, it became vast. Religion shaped their worldview as much as weather. They believed in gods who walked among them: Odin, wise and wandering; Thor, strong and stormy; Freya, gentle and fertile. These gods were not distant but near, present in the thunder, in the growth of crops, in the fortune of voyages. Rituals were performed at groves and stones offerings made to keep favor. In long nights, stories of gods and heroes were told, blending faith with imagination, giving meaning to hardship and joy alike. The sea was never far away. It glittered between fjords, rolled upon coasts, whispered in the distance. It gave food in fish and whales, seals and seabirds. It gave danger in storms, hunger, and shipwreck. It gave promise in horizons unseen. To live in Scandinavia was to live always with the sea at one's side, as neighbor, as adversary, as endless invitation. And so it was that the first voyages began. Not as grand raids but as quiet departures, a small boat sliding into water, its hull carved from oak, its oars dipping steadily, a family crossing to a nearby island, a trader bringing goods to another village, a fisherman venturing farther than before. Step by step, voyage by voyage, the people grew accustomed to the water, and when the longships gained slender and strong, they were ready. But for now, before we rush ahead, let us remain on those shores. Imagine the early morning mist hanging low above a fjord. The water is calm, reflecting mountains whose peaks are still covered in snow even in spring. Smoke curls from the roof of a longhouse. A shepherd leads sheep to graze. A fisherman checks his nets. Children run along the water's edge, their laughter quiet against the still air. And beyond, a boat waits, its planks smelling of fresh-cut oak, its oars resting inside, ready to carry someone across the next stretch of water. This is the beginning, not of raids, not of empires, but of voyaging, the shore, the sea, the people, the patience, the Vikings, before the name Viking was ever spoken. If the shore was the cradle of Viking life, then the longship was its heartbeat. Without ships, the people of the north might have remained only farmers and fishers, bound by land and season. With ships, they became travelers, traders, explorers, and wanderers of seas. The longship was not only a vessel of wood, it was an idea, a rhythm, a quiet companion that carried them farther than they could have dreamed. The forests of Scandinavia were the beginning. Tall pines and sturdy oaks grew in the valleys and along the hills, their roots deep in the cold soil, their branches swaying with the northern winds. The carpenter's eye measured these trees not only as trunks but as future ribs and keels. With axes of iron, men cut into them, the sound of wood splitting echoing softly through the woods. They worked slowly, carefully, respecting the grain of the timber, knowing that a ship made poorly might break upon the waves, but a ship made well could outlast storms. Logs were dragged by oxen to villages near water. There, the shipwrights gathered men who carried knowledge in their hands more than in words. They laid out keels, long beams that would form the spine of the ship. From this spine, ribs rose, curving like the bones of a living creature, giving the vessel its shape. Planks were split and smoothed, then overlapped in the style known as clinker built, each plank fastened with iron rivets, sealed with tar, forming a hull both strong and flexible. This was no simple craft. It was the art of centuries, passed from hand to hand, from master to apprentice, each generation adding to the wisdom of the last. The longship was slender and shallow. Its keel was narrow, its draft light, so that it could slip not only across oceans but also into rivers and estuaries. A Viking ship could sail upon the sea, yet also glide upriver. Where others could not follow, it could be beached upon sand, without breaking, hauled onto land by men with ropes and rollers, carried even from one water to another. It was both seabird and river fish at home wherever there was water. Upon the deck, there was no heavy cabin, no great hall, but only open space for oarsmen, shields, and cargo. The ship was both simple and perfect, designed for speed and silence. A row of oars lined each side, their blades dipping rhythmically into the water, each stroke timed like a heartbeat. Steady and sure, above rose a single mast, bearing a square sail, often woven of wool, dyed in stripes of red or brown. When the wind filled it, the ship leapt forward, creaking softly as ropes tightened and timber bent. To sit upon such a ship was to feel both freedom and humility. The sea stretched endlessly. The ship was small, yet it carried life. The oars dipped with rhythm. The sail cracked with wind. The water whispered against the hull. There was no noise of engines, no clutter of machines, only the human voice, the creak of wood, the breath of waves. It was a voyage not of conquest alone, but of listening, of moving slowly across the skin of the earth. The long ship had many forms. The narrow was the trader's ship, broader and deeper, built to carry cargo across long distances, wool, furs, amber, and grain outbound, silver, wine, and spices returning. The drekker, or dragon ship, was longer and narrower, built for raiding, its prow often carved into the head of a serpent or beast, a silent guardian against waves and spirits. Smaller boats served farmers and fishers, sturdy enough for fjords and coasts. Each ship had its place, but all shared the same soul, light, strong, swift. Construction itself was slow and patient. Tar was boiled from pine roots, thick and sticky, painted into seams to keep water out. Wool was woven into sails, each thread spun by hand, each cloth heavy when wet, yet powerful when the wind caught it. Ropes were twisted from animal hair or hemp, pulled taut across beams, binding mast and hull together. Nothing was wasted, every part had purpose. Even the curved prow, sometimes plain, sometimes adorned, was not only decoration but a guide, a prayer to the sea for safe passage. The launch of a ship was a ceremony. Villagers gathered, the keel resting upon wooden rollers, ropes ready. Men pushed, women and children watched, and slowly the vessel slid toward the water. When it touched the waves, it rocked gently, as though waking from slumber. The oars were placed, the sail raised, and for the first time, it moved with the current. Some say that offerings were made, bread, ale, even blood, to ask the gods for safe journeys. Whether true or legend, the launch was always more than a moment of craft. It was a moment of life. A ship was not just wood, it was the bridge between land and horizon. Life aboard was not easy. There was little shelter. Men sat upon benches, rowing for hours, their hands blistered, their backs aching. When not rowing, they rested against shields or packs, sleeping beneath woolen cloaks. Food was simple: dried fish, bread, cheese, sometimes meat salted to last. Water was carried in barrels, ale brewed for voyages. Fires could not be lit upon the deck, so meals were cold or simple, unless the ship stopped upon land. Yet even in hardship there was rhythm. The sea gave patience, the ship gave motion. Together they carried men across distances once thought impossible. And so the long ship became more than tool, it became a symbol. To the Vikings, it was freedom. To their neighbors, it was fear. To us, it is memory, a vessel that carried people, not only to raids and wars, but also to settlements in Iceland, Greenland, even to the edge of North America. It was their wings, their roads, their paths across the mist. Imagine it now. The sea is calm, mist hangs low, silver and soft. A long ship drifts, its oars dipping slowly, its sails slack in still air. The men are quiet, their eyes on the horizon. The wood creaks, the water whispers, the air smells of salt and tar. No sound of battle, no cry of fear, only silence, broken by the steady rhythm of oars. The ship glides forward, carrying dreams of distant shores. This is the longship, silent, timber, patient sail, a vessel of journeys across misty seas. Before the sails caught the winds of faraway seas, before names like Iceland and Greenland were spoken in sagas, the first Viking journeys were small, almost humble. They began close to home, among the fjords and rivers of Scandinavia. These voyages were not raids, nor quests for conquest, but simple crossings, steady journeys made out of necessity, curiosity, and rhythm. The fjords themselves were teachers, deep inlets carved by ancient ice, their waters calm yet cold, their sides towering with stone and forest. To stand upon a fjord's edge was to feel the world narrow into a long path of water, stretching between cliffs that seemed eternal. Villages dotted these inlets, their turf-roofed halls clinging to slopes, smoke rising faintly into the morning air. Between them, water was the road. To travel meant to row. To carry goods meant to load boats. To meet neighbors, to trade, to fish, to hunt, everything depended upon water. The rivers, too, were lifelines. They wound through forests, linking lakes to seas, valleys to fjords. Boats glided upon their currents, shallow-drafted longships, slipping easily over sandbanks, their oars dipping without sound but for the splash of water. On their banks, birch and pine leaned over, their reflections broken by ripples. Deer moved softly through the trees, birds sang above. Voyages here were quiet, almost dreamlike, a blending of wood, water, and sky. For those first voyagers, the ship was both freedom and burden. Oarsmen rowed in unison, their strokes measured, their backs strong but weary. The creak of timber mixed with the soft murmur of voices, men speaking of weather, of fields, of families left behind on the shore. Children sometimes sat upon the benches, learning the rhythm of oars, their small hands grasping handles that were too heavy, their eyes wide as the boat slid forward. Women rowed as well, tending to baskets of goods, sewing sails, or simply watching the horizon. These were not war bands, but families, neighbors, communities moving together across familiar waters. The horizon of those first voyages was not far. A nearby island with good pastures, a village at the mouth of a fjord, a fishing ground where cod swam deep. Yet each journey carried a kind of quiet daring. To push the prow into the mist was to step into the unknown, even if only for a few miles. Storms could rise suddenly, winds could turn, waves could overwhelm. Every voyage required patience, trust in timber and crew, and respect for the sea. Still, the sea rewarded them. Nets drawn up heavy with fish, seals hunted upon rocky shores, driftwood gathered for fires, amber found along coasts, shining like golden drops of sunlight. Trade brought furs from inland hunters, salt from distant bays, even whispers of silver from lands farther south. The small boats carried not only goods, but also stories, linking one settlement to another, carrying news, songs, and memory. It is easy to imagine such a day. The mist hangs low above a fjord. A longship pushes off from shore, its prow cutting the still surface. Oars dip in rhythm, plunk, 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 sending ripples outward in soft circles. Men row steadily, their faces calm, their movements practiced. Women sit near the center, baskets of cloth and grain beside them. Children lean over the edge, trailing fingers in cold water, giggling at the chill. A dog shifts restlessly, its ears pricked, its eyes on the passing shore. The cliffs rise on either side, green with pine, dark with shadow. A waterfall spills down, white and foaming, its sound faint yet steady. The air smells of salt, of damp wood, of woolen cloaks heavy with morning dew. The boat glides forward, its wake spreading like a silver path behind. No drums beat, no horns call, only the quiet breath of oars and the occasional murmur of voices. When they reach the next village, the people gather at the shore. Nets are exchanged, tools bartered, stories shared. Perhaps an elder tells of a storm years ago when a boat was lost. Perhaps a trader speaks of a distant market where coins are exchanged for amber. The boats rest on the pebbled beach there, hulls glistening with spray, their sails folded, their oars stacked neatly inside. The voyagers eat simple meals, bread, dried fish, ale brewed from barley before preparing for the return, and then, slowly, the ship pushes off once more. The oars dip again, the sail rises when the wind permits, and the boat glides back into the mist. The fjord narrows, the cliffs darken, the water deepens. The voyagers are tired, but the rhythm of the oars carries them. Each stroke is steady, each breath calm. The ship, like a living creature, moves forward without hurry. These were the first voyages, modest, near, almost ordinary. Yet they were the foundation of all that would follow. From fjords to rivers, from rivers to seas, from seas to oceans, each journey built upon the last. The Vikings would one day cross to distant lands, but first they learned patience in their own waters. They learned rhythm in oars, trust in timber, courage in mist. They learned that the horizon was not an end, but a beginning, and so we leave them here in imagination, gliding slowly along a fjord beneath the watchful cliffs. The mist thickens, the oars dip, the voices soften, the boat drifts, carrying not conquest, not war, but simple life goods, families, stories across quiet horizons. When we imagine the Vikings, it is easy to think first of their ships, of their journeys of horizons filled with mist and salt, but for most of their lives, they were not at sea, they were at home. Upon land, in small villages that clung to fjords and valleys, life for the Viking people was not constant adventure, but constant rhythm, a rhythm of sowing and reaping, of casting and hauling, of tending and mending. Their world was built as much upon soil and net as upon timber and sail. The villages of Scandinavia were modest but enduring. Longhouses stood at their center, their walls made of timber planks, their roofs covered with turf and thatch, thick enough to keep out winter winds. Inside, one hall might house an entire family, sometimes 2 or 3 generations together. Smoke drifted upward from the central hearth, blackening the beams above. Benches lined the walls, covered with furs, where people slept. Tools and goods hung from posts, spears, nets, wooden buckets, woven baskets. Chickens pecked outside, goats and sheep bleated in pens, dogs kept watch near doors. These were not places of grandeur, but of life, sturdy and warm against the northern cold. Farming was the heartbeat of the village. The soil was not always rich, but it was cared for carefully. Barley was the most common crop, used for bread and for brewing ale. Rye and oats grew too, their grains ground into meal. Cabbage and onions, beans and peas filled small gardens, tended by women and children. Flax was grown for weaving, its fibers spun into linen cloth. In summer, the fields rippled gold, in autumn they were cut and gathered, stored for the long winter months. Animals were essential companions. Cattle gave milk, sheep gave wool, goats gave both. Horses, sturdy and small, pulled plows and carried loads. Pigs rooted in the forest, their meat salted for storage. Chickens gave eggs, their clucking a constant sound around the halls. Dogs guarded homes, cats kept down mice, falcons sometimes hunted with men. Life was not separate from animals, but intertwined. Each creature had purpose, each one part of the balance of survival. Fishing, too, was life. Nets were woven by hand, their cords knotted carefully, their floats carved from wood. Men set them in fjords and rivers, drawing in cod, herring, salmon. Boats small and sturdy carried them farther to sea, where whales sometimes rose, their breath spouting into the sky. Seals were hunted for meat and hides, seabirds for eggs and feathers. The sea gave endlessly, but it demanded effort and respect. A storm could overturn a boat, an empty net could mean hunger. A harsh winter could strip stores too quickly. Still, the people learned patience, casting nets again and again, trusting that the waters would provide. The rhythm of work was softened by community. Villagers shared labor. Men mended fences together. Women spun wool in groups. Children herded sheep along paths. At harvest, Neighbors gathered to cut, bind, and store grain, singing softly as they worked. At slaughter time, animals were shared, each family receiving meat, each household storing enough to endure. Life was not solitary, but woven like cloth, each person a thread in the fabric of the village. Evenings were gentle. After work, the hearth was lit, smoke curling through the roof, firelight flickering across wooden beams. Families sat upon benches, eating meals of bread, cheese, fish, or stew simmered slowly in iron pots. Ale was poured, stories told, songs sung. Children listened to tales of gods and heroes, their eyes wide in firelight. Women spun wool, their hands steady, their voices soft. Men carved wood, mended tools, sharpened blades. Outside, the night deepened, stars bright above, wind whispering through trees. The hall became a world of warmth, holding out against the cold. Seasons guided everything. In spring, fields were plowed, lambs were born, nets were mended. In summer, the sun lingered, crops ripened, boats fished long into evening. In autumn, grain was harvested, animals slaughtered, stores filled. In winter, life turned inward, snow-covered fields, rivers froze. Nights grew long, work slowed, but did not stop. Wood was chopped, tools repaired, cloth woven, stories told. Winter was hard, but it was also a time of closeness, of gathering by the hearth, of patience and endurance. Religion was part of village life, woven into daily rhythm. Small altars were raised, offerings given, grain, ale, meat to honor gods and spirits. The people saw divine presence in harvests, in storms, in births, in hunts. Odin, Thor, Freya, and Njord, and many more were spoken of not as distant beings but as near companions. When thunder rolled, Thor's hammer was striking. When crops grew, Freya's blessing had touched them. The village did not separate sacred from daily life. The two were threads of the same fabric. Imagine it now in quiet detail. A small Viking village in summer. The sun hangs low but bright, the air warm, the fields golden. Men swing scythes, cutting barley, their rhythm slow and steady. Women bind sheaves, stacking them neatly, their laughter drifting across the field. Children chase one another near the riverbank, their feet splashing in shallow water. A fisherman hauls in his net, the silver of fish glimmering in sunlight. Goats graze near the longhouse. A dog barks lazily. Chickens scatter at the sound. Smoke rises from the hearth, carrying the smell of baking bread. The world is busy, but it is calm. A harmony of effort and quiet joy. As night falls, the village gathers. In the hall, the fire crackles. A woman spins wool, her hands practiced, her voice humming an old tune. A man carves wood into a small figure, shaping it with patience. Children curl upon furs, drowsy, listening to a story of Thor's hammer or Odin's wisdom. The hall glows, the wind sighs outside. The stars shine above. It is not grandeur, is not war, it is life, steady, quiet, enduring. This was the heart of the Viking world. Not only the sea, not only the ship, not only the raid, but the farm, the net, the hearth, the hall. This was where voyages began and where they ended. This was where memory was kept and where futures were shaped. This was the quiet village life, simple yet strong, gentle yet enduring. The soil upon which the great journeys of Misty Seas would forever rest. The Vikings did not live only in fields and fjords, nor only in boats and halls. They also lived in stories and rituals, in the quiet presence of gods and spirits. To them, the world was never silent. The rustle of wind through pine trees might be Odin passing unseen. The roll of thunder across mountains was Thor striking his hammer. The richness of harvest was Freya's blessing. The sea itself was alive with Njord's breath. Religion for the Vikings was not a matter of distant temples or vast cathedrals. It was woven into the daily rhythm of life, as close as the soil beneath their feet, as near as the fire upon the hearth. There were sacred groves where trees were never cut, standing stones where offerings were laid, rivers and waterfalls thought to carry the voices of unseen beings. Ritual was not separate from life, it was life itself, acknowledged, honored. whispered. In villages, small altars might stand near homes, stones blackened by offerings of ale or blood. Families poured the first cup of mead to the gods before drinking themselves. At harvest, a sheaf of grain was set aside, left for the spirits of fertility. When animals were slaughtered, some blood was sprinkled upon the ground as gift. The rituals were not grand, but they were steady, repeated through seasons, as much a part of survival as fishing or farming. Yet there were larger gatherings too, at special times, such as midwinter or midsummer. Whole communities joined in feasts and sacrifices. A great hall was filled with people, fires roaring, food laid upon tables, ale flowed from horns, songs echoed, stories were told. At such times animals were sacrificed, their blood offered to the gods, their meat shared among the people. To outsiders, this may seem grim, but to the Vikings it was balance. A gift returned for the gifts of life itself. The myths were carried, not in books but in memory, sung by poets, spoken by elders, repeated by firelight. They told of Asgard, the home of the gods, connected to Midgard, the world of humans, by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. They told of Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, who gave up his eye for wisdom, who hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, to learn the runes. They told of Thor, protector of mankind, whose hammer Mjolnir struck down giants and blessed marriages alike. They told of Freya, goddess of love and fertility, who wept tears of gold, who guided souls into the afterlife. They told of Loki, cunning and changeable, a trickster whose schemes brought both mischief and fate. These stories gave meaning to the world. They explained thunder and lightning, growth and death, luck and misfortune, but more than explanation, they gave companionship. The people did not feel alone. They felt surrounded by gods, by ancestors, by unseen presences who watched, who guided, who sometimes tested. Runes carved into wood or stone carried sacred power. They were letters, yes, but also more than letters. To carve a rune was to invoke. A name carved into a blade gave it strength. A charm carved into wood gave it protection. Runes were not written casually. They were etched with patience, with respect, with quiet. The carver often whispered as he worked, speaking to the rune, asking it to live. The afterlife was not one place, but many. The bravest warriors were said to go to Valhalla, where Odin welcomed them with endless feasts, but others went to Folkvanger, Freya's hall, equally noble. Some souls were said to linger in mounds, the burial places beneath grassy hills. Others drifted into hell, not a place of torment, but of quiet, ruled by the goddess Hel, half living, half dead. The Vikings did not fear death as emptiness, but as passage, one way or another into another hall, another shore. Imagine such a night in a quiet Viking village. The day's work is done. The fields lie dark, the animals sleep, the nets are hung to dry inside the longhouse. The fire burns low. Children gather near an elder, their faces lit by flickering flame. The elder's voice is slow, deliberate, weaving the tale of Thor's journey to the land of giants, or of Odin's sacrifice for wisdom. The children listen, wide-eyed, lulled by the rhythm of words. Outside, wind moves through the trees, sounding almost like voices answering. Elsewhere, a man carves runes upon a small piece of bone, muttering softly, asking for safe voyage. A woman pours a little ale upon the ground, whispering thanks for the harvest. At the edge of the forest, a stone stands upright, its surface stained from offerings. The village rests. But it does not feel empty, it feels accompanied, washed by gods and ancestors alike. Rituals and myths gave the Vikings not only guidance, but calmness. They gave order to a world that was vast, cold, unpredictable. They reminded people that they were not alone, that their lives were part of a greater story, that even the smallest act, a cup poured, a rune carved, a tale told, was part of the great weaving of fate. And so, as we imagine them tonight, we see not raiders or warriors, but families gathered in firelight, voices murmuring, stories flowing. Like rivers, we see gods not in battle, but in presence, in thunder rolling across hills, in frost forming upon windows, in seeds pushing through soil. We see ritual not as grand spectacle, but as quiet companionship, a reminder that life is always shared, never solitary. The Viking story that most of the world remembers begins with raids, monasteries aflame, coastal villages startled awake, sails appearing like ghosts upon the horizon. Yet before we imagine the clamor, we must first linger in the silence that came before the quiet shores, the calm seas, the slow journeys that carried ships from fjords to foreign lands. The first raids were not born in sudden violence. They were the continuation of voyages, of curiosity stretched farther, of necessity mingled with opportunity. In the beginning, the journeys were small. Viking ships had tested their strength in fjords and rivers, then across narrow seas. The Baltic was familiar, its shores dotted with trading towns and rival tribes. Across the Skagerrak lay England and the Frankish coasts, not yet well known but whispered of in markets. Merchants spoke of silver coins, of monasteries filled with treasures, of rich pastures and undefended shores. To the Vikings, such words were seeds planted in imagination, slowly growing into action. The longships, slender and swift, were made for this. Unlike heavy merchant vessels, they could move silently, hugging coastlines, slipping into rivers, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. A crew of 30 or 40 men could row for hours, their oars dipping in unison, their breath steady, their eyes fixed upon the horizon. At night, they beached their ship upon sand, hauling it beyond the tide, sleeping wrapped in cloaks beneath the stars. Fires burned low, voices murmured quietly, the sea whispering close by. It was not the noise of an army, but the patience of wanderers. The first targets were monasteries, not because they were holy, but because they were vulnerable. Monasteries stood upon coasts or islands, their stone walls built for prayer, not for defense. They held books, relics, golden vessels, and silver crosses, riches gathered through years of devotion. To the monks, these treasures were sacred. To the Vikings, they were portable, valuable, and unguarded. Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the coast of Northumbria, became the most famous of these first raids. In the year 793, ships appeared upon its shore. Monks saw the sails, perhaps first thinking of traders, perhaps too late realizing the truth. The longships landed, men leapt to shore, axes in hand, shields upon arms. The monastery was plundered, its treasures taken, its silence broken. The news spread like fire, and Europe learned a new word, Viking. But if we pause and look more gently, we see not only violence. We see the long journey that brought the ships there. Imagine the crew, leaving their fjord in Norway, their families watching from the shore. The sail rises, striped in red and brown, filling with wind. The men row when the breeze fades, their strokes slow, steady. Days pass. They share bread and dried fish, drink ale from barrels, sleep in shifts. They watch the stars at night guiding their course. They listen to gulls, to waves, to the creak of timber. The voyage is long, but the sea carries them. When they finally sight land, it is dawn. Mist drifts above the water. A monastery stands upon an island, its bells ringing faintly. The men lower the sail, grip their oars, and row silently toward the shore. The ship glides, its dragon prow cutting through mist. The monks, perhaps, look up from their prayers and see the silhouette forming. The shore is quiet, the air still, but within that quiet is a weight, the weight of change. The raid itself is brief, a flash of noise in a world otherwise silent. But for the Vikings, it is not chaos, it is necessity. Silver, food, and captives are taken. The ship is loaded quickly. Oars dip again. The longship pulls away, vanishing into sea mist as suddenly as it appeared. Behind, the monastery lies, broken, its silence shattered. Ahead, the Vikings roll back into the rhythm of waves, their faces calm, their voices quiet. The first raids shocked Europe, but for the Vikings, they were not so extraordinary. They were extensions of what they already knew: travel, trade, survival. To them, raiding was only one form of exchange, harder, quicker, riskier. They were not constant marauders. They were farmers who raided in summer and returned to harvest in autumn. They were neighbors, fathers, brothers, sons. Their lives were not defined by violence alone, but by the steady balance of sea and soil. The silence before the storm was always longer than the storm itself. Days of rowing, nights of sleeping beneath stars, mornings of watching the sun rise over calm seas. The raid was but a moment, the voyage was the life, and so we imagined them tonight, not in fire, but in mist, a ship gliding through dawn, its crew rowing steadily, their shields stacked along the rails, their eyes upon the shore ahead. The monastery bells ring faint and clear. The ship moves closer, silent as a shadow. The air is calm, the sea is smooth, the world is still. In that stillness, history turns. The Vikings lived beside water all their lives, yet no sea was as testing, as moody, as full of shifting moods as the North Sea. To cross it was to step into a restless expanse, where waves rolled endlessly and winds turned without warning. The voyages to Britain, to Ireland, to the coasts of France, all of them required braving the sea. It was the bridge between their fjords and the wider world, and though they came to know it well, it was never gentle. From the shores of Norway or Denmark, the sea stretched outward like a gray sheet, broken only by gulls and distant shadows. The longship, slender and shallow, slid into its waters, its crew bracing for days of rowing and sailing. Unlike the calm fjords or sheltered rivers, here the water was alive with change. Waves lifted and lowered the ship. The horizon vanished behind mist. Storms rose suddenly, lightning flashing across iron skies. To the Vikings, it was both obstacle and teacher. They learned patience upon these waves, endurance in long nights, and humility in the face of the sea's power. Life aboard a longship on the North Sea was simple, but hard. There was no shelter, no cabin to shield from rain or spray. Men sat side by side upon benches, their hands gripping oars, their cloaks pulled tight against wind. When the sail filled, they rested. But the ship still required guidance. Ropes pulled, tiller steered, mast adjusted. Meals were cold, drawn from sacks. Bread, dried fish, cheese, sometimes ale from barrels, passed carefully between them. At night, they slept where they sat, wrapped in cloaks, shields propped as wind breaks. Their dreams were short, broken by the roll of waves, by the creak of wood, by the slap of water against hull. The sea was a rhythm, a sound without end. Waves struck, oars dipped, ropes groaned, sails cracked, voices called. At times, when the wind was kind, it carried them swiftly, the ship gliding like a bird across the surface. At other times, the wind turned fierce, and men fought to keep the prow from swinging, to keep the ship from overturning. Rain stung, mist blinded, thunder roared, and yet through it all, they endured, their faces steady, their strokes unbroken. They were not strangers to hardship. It was the air they breathed. Navigation across such seas was not simple, yet the Vikings mastered it with senses sharpened by years. They watched the sun by day, the stars by night, guiding by the North Star, by the rising and setting of constellations. They studied the flight of birds, the color of water, the drift of clouds, even the smell of seaweed carried on air. They learned to read the sea as a farmer reads fields, noting its patterns, its moods, its small signs that revealed direction. Some say they carried ravens aboard, releasing them to see where land lay, following the bird as it flew homeward. Whether truth or legend, their skill was real. They crossed the North Sea not by chance, but by knowledge, and yet, for all their knowledge, the sea remained larger than them. There were nights when fog surrounded them, when no star was visible, when the waves drew high and the men whispered prayers into the darkness. There were mornings when ships foundered, when families on shore waited in vain for fathers or sons to return. The sea took as much as it gave. To live by it was to accept both gifts and grief. Still, imagine such a voyage on a calmer day. The wind is steady, filling the striped sail. The sea is not calm, but it is kind, its waves rolling gently. Men row slowly, their oars dipping in rhythm, their voices humming low songs to keep time. A boy sits near the prow, his eyes wide, watching. Gulls circle. A woman tends to baskets of goods, grain, wool, perhaps silver from past trade, while men mend ropes, carve wood, or simply rest with cloaks pulled tight. The horizon is wide, the air smells of salt. The ship moves steadily forward. It is not war, not conquest, but journey long, patient, endless as the sea itself. Night falls slowly upon the water. The sail lowers. The ship drifts with current. Stars emerge, their reflection trembling in the waves. Men lie upon benches, their cloaks pulled to their chins, their shields stacked near. One man keeps watch, his eyes scanning darkness, his hand resting on the tiller. The sea is not silent, it sighs, it murmurs, it rolls, but within its sound is a lullaby, steady, endless, carrying the ship onward. Crossing the North Sea was never easy, but it became the Vikings' path, their highway, of salt and mist. Each voyage was a lesson, each storm a teacher, each star a guide. To imagine them only as raiders is to forget these nights and days of endurance, these long silences upon water, these voyages that were more patient than violent. The North Sea shaped them as much as their own axes and plows did. It taught them the rhythm of waves, the humility of distance, the calmness of waiting for land to appear out of mist. And so, as we drift with them tonight, we do not hear thunder or cries of war. We hear oars dipping, sails snapping, waves murmuring. We see men wrapped in cloaks, women tending baskets, children watching gulls. We see stars above, water below, and endless horizon ahead. We are upon the North Sea in long nights, in restless waves, yet in the patience of voyage, in the silence of endurance. The Vikings are remembered for their ships, their raids, their restless voyages across misty seas. Yet perhaps their deepest mark upon history was not in battles fought or treasures taken, but in the quiet building of settlements, far from their Scandinavian homelands. These places, at first small and fragile, became bridges between cultures, foundations for trade, and homes for generations. If the ship was the Vikings' road, the settlement was their anchor. Their earliest voyages carried them to coasts not far from home, the shores of the British Isles, the islands of the North Atlantic, the river mouths of France all became familiar. At first, they arrived as raiders, striking quickly, leaving swiftly, but some discovered that it was easier to remain than to return. The soil was fertile, the rivers rich in fish, the trade routes busy. Slowly, carefully, they began to build out in England. They landed upon beaches and river mouths. Villages were raided, yes, but some were also settled. In the north and east of the island, communities grew, places where Scandinavian tongues mixed with Anglo-Saxon, where longhouses stood beside English halls. York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, became a thriving town. Streets were lined with workshops of blacksmiths, weavers, potters. Markets bustled with traders selling furs, amber, silver, wool, and bread. Children played in alleys, their accents blended from two worlds. The city grew into one of the most important in northern Europe, its roots Viking, its branches reaching outward. Across the sea in Ireland, Dublin began as a Viking camp, a long fort built upon the river Liffey. At first it was a fortified harbor for ships, a place to rest and repair between raids. But soon it grew. Houses of timber and wattle lined the banks. Warehouses held goods from near and far. Wine from France, silver from England, furs from the north, slaves taken in war. By the 10th century, Dublin had become a bustling town. Its Norse rulers connected not only to Scandinavia, but to Europe as a whole. The settlement, born of raids, matured into trade, into life, into permanence. Farther still, they sailed west, to islands in the cold Atlantic, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Hebrides. These scattered places became stepping stones for voyages, but also homes in their own right. Families moved there, raising sheep, planting barley, building longhouses near the sea. The wind howled, the winters were hard, yet the people endured, just as they had in Scandinavia. Stones from these settlements still remain, their outlines visible in green hills swept by waves. And farther yet to Iceland. Sometime around the late 9th century, Viking explorers landed upon its black volcanic shores. At first, it seemed barren, a land of rock and ice, but hot springs bubbled, rivers teemed with fish, valleys held pastures. Slowly, ships brought families, livestock, tools. Settlements spread across the coasts, small farms dotting the land. Here, far from kings and armies, the settlers built their own society. With assemblies called the Althing, one of the earliest forms of communal governance in Europe, Iceland became not only a settlement, but a new homeland, its sagas later preserving the memory of voyages and lives lived in a land of fire and frost. Greenland, too, received settlers. On the year 985, Eric the Red led people westward, naming the land Greenland in hope of attracting others. It was harsher than Iceland, colder, lonelier, but farms were carved along its fjords. Sheep grazed, crops grew in brief summers, and ships brought goods back and forth. For centuries, Norse families lived there, their homes still standing today as ruins of stone walls and churches. Even North America felt their touch. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, is said to have reached Vinland, perhaps Newfoundland, around the year 1000. There, the Vikings built small settlements, timber halls, workshops, places for wintering. The experiment was brief, the settlements abandoned, but they left behind fragments of iron nails, hearths, and stories. For a moment, the Vikings had crossed the ocean, their settlements reaching farther than any before them. Yet not all settlements were distant. Along rivers of Eastern Europe, Vikings known as Varangians founded towns that became great cities. Novgorod, Kiev, they traded along the rivers, connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium, to the Black Sea, to the reaches of the south. Their settlements became crossroads of cultures, where Slavic, Norse, and Byzantine influences mingled. What defined these settlements was not grandeur, but rhythm. Timber houses built near water, smoke rising from hearths, fields of barley swaying, nets hung to dry, markets bustling with exchange, children playing near walls, dogs barking, goats bleating, chickens clucking. Life was much the same as in Scandinavia, only upon new soil. The settlements were not monuments, but homes. Imagine one of them now in the 10th century, a small Viking town upon a riverbank, wooden houses line narrow streets. A smith's hammer rings from a workshop. Women weave wool, their looms clicking softly. Traders call out in mixed tongues, Morse, Saxon, Gaelic. Children chase one another between market stalls. A ship rests at the dock, its hull full of furs and amber. Beyond, fields stretch, farmers bent over rows of barley. The air smells of smoke, of fish, of bread baking. The settlement hums quietly, not with war, but with life. For the Vikings, these distant shores became more than destinations. They became homes. The settlers planted roots, raised children, buried their dead. They carried their myths, their gods, their runes, their stories, across seas, embedding them in foreign soil. And though wars and raids marked their history, so too did quiet villages, farms, and towns, places where lives were lived in rhythm, where silence held as much meaning as conquest. The settlements, though sometimes forgotten beside the drama of raids, remind us of the deeper Viking story. It was not only a story of restless voyages, but of patience, endurance, and belonging. From fjords to rivers, from islands to continents, the Vikings left behind not only traces of fear, but also traces of life, timber, stone, smoke, and soil. So we see them tonight, not in dragon-proud ships at dawn, but in quiet homes upon new shores. The longship rests at dock, The hearth glows within halls, voices murmur in mixed tongues. The settlement breathes steady and calm, part of the endless rhythm of human history. When most think of Vikings, they imagine raids, sails on the horizon, villages aflame, treasure carried away. But the quieter truth is that much of their wealth came not from battle, but from trade. The Vikings were not only warriors and sailors, they were merchants, middlemen of the north, carrying goods across seas and rivers, linking worlds that had rarely touched before. Their ships were not always filled with axes and shields. Often they carried furs, amber, iron, and fish. Their legacy was not only in fear but in exchange in markets, in the steady rhythm of trade routes that spanned from the icy seas to the warm markets of Byzantium. The Scandinavian homelands offered resources that others desired. Furs of fox, bear, and beaver were prized for warmth and luxury. Walrus ivory, carved from the tusks of Arctic creatures, was sought for art and ornaments. Amber, the golden resin washed upon Baltic shores, was treasured as far away as Rome and the East. Iron from Swedish mines was strong and plentiful, worked into tools and weapons. Dried fish, salted to last, became a staple for feeding distant cities. Even slaves, captured in raids or taken in war, were traded. Human lives, sold in markets, carried across seas. In return came silver, coins from Anglo-Saxon England, dirhams from the Islamic world, deniers from Francia. The Vikings were not a coin-making people at first, but they valued silver by weight. Arm rings and ingots were cut into pieces. Scales carried by merchants to measure value. In hoards buried beneath fields, archaeologists still find fragments of coins from distant lands, testifying to the reach of Viking trade. The routes stretched wide, across the North Sea. Ships carried goods to England, to Ireland, to the coasts of Francia. Down rivers of Europe, they reached markets inland, exchanging amber for wine, furs for cloth. Across the Baltic, they sailed to the lands of the Slavs, building trading posts like Hedeby and Burka, where cultures mingled and languages mixed. Along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Volga, they sailed as Varangians, carrying goods all the way to Constantinople, the shining capital of Byzantium. There, their ships docked beside marble quays. Their traders walked beneath domes and mosaics, their silver exchanged for silk, spices, and gold. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, was one of the greatest Viking trading towns. Its streets bustled with workshops, smiths forging iron, glassmakers blowing beads, leatherworkers crafting shoes. Ships arrived daily, their cargo unloaded onto docks, their crews haggling in markets. Merchants from far and near met their Franks, Slavs, Danes, Saxons. Goods passed hand to hand, salt, honey, amber, wool, fish. Hedeby hummed not with war, but with life. A steady murmur of voices, and trade. Björka in Sweden was another hub, built upon an island in Lake Mälaren. It was a meeting point between inland resources and sea trade. Merchants gathered there, coins clinked, runes were carved into sticks recording bargains. It was a place where cultures touched, where Arab, silver dirhams were found beside Scandinavian beads, where eastern silks brushed against northern furs. Burka's markets glowed with diversity, quiet testimony to the Vikings' role as connectors of worlds. The Ross Vikings, who settled along the rivers of Eastern Europe, carried this trade farther still. They rowed their ships along winding waters, dragging them across portages where rivers did not connect, enduring swamps, forests, and raids by rivals. They reached Kiev, Novgorod, and beyond, creating networks of commerce that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Some of these men, the Varangian Guard, even served in Byzantium, their axes guarding emperors, their presence a reminder that the North had reached the heart of the South. Trade was not only goods, but ideas. Christianity spread along these routes, carried first by missionaries, then by merchants. Writing and language shifted as cultures met, stories and myths mingled. Norse sagas carrying echoes of foreign lands. The Vikings did not remain untouched. By those they traded with, they absorbed, they adapted, they changed. Their settlements grew into towns not of raiders, but of merchants, where peace was often more profitable than war. Imagine such a market day in Hedeby. The morning mist still clings to the harbor. Longships are docked, their sails furled, their decks loaded with cargo. Merchants unload sacks of furs, bundles of wool, crates of dried fish. Traders from the south open chests filled with fine cloth, glass beads, wine in amphorae. A crowd gathers, men in cloaks of wool, women with beads around their necks, children darting between stalls. A blacksmith hammers at a forge, sparks leaping. A potter sets bowls upon a cloth. Voices rise, some loud in bargaining, some soft in greeting. Coins clink, knives cut samples of goods, dogs bark as they follow their masters through the crowd. The air smells of smoke, of salt fish, of baked bread. It is not a place of conquest, but of calm, of exchange, of life moving steadily. In these markets, we see a different Viking world, not sails filled with raid, but ships filled with trade, not swords drawn in anger, but hands extended in bargain, not fire upon coasts, but smoke rising gently from hearths. The wealth of the North was not only in what was taken, but in what was shared, carried, exchanged. And so, as we picture them tonight, the Vikings are not raiding monasteries or storming castles. They are in markets, their ships resting at docks, their voices mingling with others, their goods spread upon stalls. The rhythm is not of battle drums, but of coins clinking, of oars dipping upon calm rivers, of voices carrying across harbors. The North was restless, yes, but it was also rich, not with noise, but with quiet wealth. To understand the Vikings not only as voyagers and traders, but as people, we must step inside their homes. For all the fame of their longships, for all the fear of their raids, the greater part of Viking life was spent in longhouses, wooden halls that sheltered families, animals, stories, and silence. These were not grand castles or fortresses. They were humble, practical, enduring, and within their walls, the rhythm of Viking life beat steady, calm, and warm. The longhouse was built of timber, often pine or oak, cut from nearby forests. Its walls might be of upright planks, wattle and daub, or turf stacked thick for insulation. Its roof was steep, thatched with straw or reeds, sometimes layered with turf to keep out snow and rain. Smoke holes in the roof let out the breath of the hearth fire. Though the air within was always touched with haze, the beams darkened by years of smoke rising. These halls could stretch long 20, 30, even 50 meters narrow in width, but deep in presence, like the body of a ship turned upon land. Inside, the hall was dim and warm. The central hearth burned constantly, its fire crackling, sending sparks upward, its coals glowing through day and night. On it, benches lined the walls, covered with furs and woolen blankets, where people sat, ate, and slept. Shields and spears might hang upon the walls, not as constant weapons, but as tools ready when needed. Pots hung above the fire, still simmering slowly, filling the hall with scent of meat, herbs, and smoke. The air was thick, yet comforting, a mix of warmth, labor, and life. Families lived together, parents, children, grandparents, sometimes cousins and servants as well. Privacy was scarce, but companionship was constant. Work did not stop. With daylight, in the evenings, wool was spun, looms clicked softly, men carved wood, sharpened tools, mended nets. Children played near the fire, their voices soft, their games simple. Dogs dozed by the hearth, cats wandered, keeping mice from the grain. Life was close, woven tightly, each person a thread in the pattern of the hall. Animals were often part of the household too. In winter, cows, goats, or sheep might be brought inside, kept at one end of the hall, their warmth adding to the air. Their presence was familiar, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the smell of hay. These were not luxuries, but necessities, the blending of human and animal life into one shelter, one endurance against cold and storm. At night, the hall took on a gentler rhythm. After the evening meal, after tools were put aside, voices grew softer, stories began, elders spoke of gods and heroes, of Thor's hammer, of Odin's wisdom, of Freya's gifts. Skalds, the poets, sometimes recited sagas or sang, their words weaving memory into the present. Children listened, their eyes heavy with sleep, curled in furs. Adults nodded, sometimes adding a comment, sometimes falling silent, staring into the fire. Outside, wind might howl, snow might fall, but within, the hall was warm, steady, filled with glow. Celebrations took place in these halls too. At Yule, in the deep of winter, families gathered for feasts. Ale was poured into horns, meat roasted, songs lifted. The hall rang with laughter, clapping, the beating of drums. At weddings, at harvests, at births, the hall became a place of joy filled with voices and cheer. Yet even then, there was a rhythm, a calmness, for the hall always returned to quiet. The fire always dimmed, the voices always faded, the night always came. Imagine such a night. The day's work is done outside, snow drifts against the turf walls, the wind whistling across frozen fields. Inside, the hearth glows warmly. A woman spins wool, her spindle whirring softly. A man carves a wooden bowl, his knife scraping gently. A child curls against his mother's side, already asleep, his breath steady. A dog shifts upon straw, sighing, its tail flicking in dreams. The fire pops, smoke drifts upward. The beams creak faintly as the wind pushes. The hall is alive, but not noisy. It is a place of peace, of endurance, of patience. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was memory. Generations lived and died within the same walls. Children grew, learned, departed, returned. Ancestors were remembered in stories told by the fire, their presence felt in the wood, in the earth, in the hearth itself. The hall held not only the living, but also the echoes of the dead, and the whispers of gods in the crackle of fire and sigh of wind. To us, it may seem dark, smoky, crowded. To them, it was home, warm against the cold, close against loneliness, steady against the storms. It was the center of life, the heart of community, the space where voyages began and where they ended. The hall was as important as the ship, if the ship carried them outward. The hall drew them inward. Both were vessels, one upon sea, one upon land, each carrying people through the rhythms of their lives. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see Vikings upon battlefields or upon restless waves. We see them within their halls, gathered by the fire, their voices murmuring, their children sleeping, their hearth glowing outside. The night is cold, the snow deep, the wind restless, but within there is warmth, there is companionship, there is calm. The Viking home, the longhouse, is not a place of noise or terror. It is a place of quiet nights, of simple joys, of timeless endurance. When people speak of Vikings, they often picture men, sailors pulling at oars, warriors with axes, traders bargaining in markets. Yet Viking life was never only men upon ships. For every voyage, there was a home left behind. For every oarstroke, there was a meal prepared. For every raid, there were children raised, families tended, animals fed, fields harvested. Viking society was built not upon ships alone, but upon families, and families rested upon the strength and patience of women, the laughter of children, the closeness of kin. A Viking woman's life was filled with responsibility. She managed the household, the farm, the stores. While men sailed away in summer, sometimes for months, it was women who kept the hearth warm, the animals fed, the fields alive. She oversaw servants, if the family was wealthy, and worked with her own hands if it was not. She wove wool into cloth, spun flax into linen, stitched garments, brewed ale, prepared food. She held the keys of the household, often hanging from her belt, a symbol of authority. Keys meant control of storerooms, of wealth, of inheritance. In a world where absence was common, the woman was the anchor. Children grew up close to their mothers. Infants were swaddled in wool, carried through fields or kept near the hearth. They listened to lullabies sung in soft voices, songs that carried fragments of myth and memory. As they grew, children learned by watching and helping. Girls learned weaving, spinning, cooking, caring for animals. Boys learned to fish, to tend fields, to carve wood. But in truth, tasks were often shared, all worked where they were needed. Childhood was not separate from adulthood, it was preparation, slow and steady for life's rhythm. Play existed too, though. Children carved small toys from wood, horses, ships, figures. They played games with stones, chasing one another through fields, laughing in the narrow lanes of villages. Their voices carried across settlements, lightening the labor of adults. In evenings, they curled upon benches, listening to sagas told by elders, their eyes wide, their imaginations filled with gods and giants, heroes and voyages. For them, the world was full of wonder, half real, half story, a dream that unfolded with every word spoken by firelight. Marriage was a partnership. A bride brought dowry, cloth, livestock, sometimes land. The groom gave gifts as well, creating bonds, not only between individuals but between families. A woman could divorce if treated unjustly. She could claim property, manage farms, even inherit. Though Viking life was not free of hardship, it carried a recognition of women's strength. For without them, no voyage, no raid, no trade could endure. The hearth was as vital as the prow, the spindle as important as the sword. Inside the longhouse, family life unfolded in layers of closeness. The hearth fire glowed, meals were shared. Work was constant, yet there was tenderness too. A father carving a toy for his son, a mother brushing her daughter's hair, a grandmother singing softly to a restless infant, a boy carrying a basket of eggs, proud of his task, a girl weaving her first thread, hands clumsy but eager. These moments rarely appear in sagas, yet they were the true heart of Viking life. The family extended beyond blood. Fosterage was common. Children were often raised in other households, creating bonds of loyalty and friendship between families. These foster ties could be as strong as blood, binding communities together. Elders held wisdom, their voices respected, their stories preserved. Ancestors were remembered in rituals, their presence felt in hearths and halls, their names carried into new generations. Imagine such a scene. It is evening in a small Viking farmstead. The sun has set, the sky still glowing faintly over fjords. Inside the longhouse, the hearth burns. A woman stirs a pot of stew. It smells rich with herbs and meat. Children sit nearby, one carving a small wooden horse, another threading beads onto a string. A grandmother hums an old song, her voice low, her hands spinning wool. A man returns from tending animals, laying down his tools. Sitting by the fire, a dog lies stretched upon straw, its tail thumping faintly. The air is filled not with drama, but with closeness, the gentle rhythm of life lived together. When storms raged outside, when ships were gone for weeks, when winters pressed long and cold, this closeness mattered most. Families endured together. They shared food, shared stories, shared warmth. The hall was not just a building, it was a body of many hearts beating as one. It was the place where futures were nurtured, where memories were born, where patience held. Viking life may be remembered for its restless seas and distant raids, but beneath all of that was the quiet strength of families. Women weaving, children laughing, elders telling stories, men returning from labor. Together they formed a whole, steady against the storms of the world. Without them, the sails would not rise, the ships would not launch, the voyages would not return. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see warriors upon battlefields or ships vanishing into mist. We see families gathered by the fire, children giggling softly, women spinning, men carving, elders speaking. The whole glows, the night deepens, the voices murmur. It is life itself, steady, calm, enduring the gentle rhythm of family. Viking life, for all its labor and hardship, was not without joy. Work in fields and voyages upon seas demanded patience and endurance. But there were also moments when the rhythm of life paused, when families and communities gathered, when laughter echoed through halls, when food and drink were shared in abundance. These were festivals and feasts, the slow, steady joys of gathering that brightened the long winters and marked the seasons of the year. The most important of these was Yule, the midwinter feast. In the depth of cold, when nights were long and the sun barely touched the horizon, families gathered in their halls, fires burning brightly, food laid out upon wooden boards. The feast lasted many days, sometimes 12 nights or more. Ale was brewed and poured into horns, meat flowed, meat roasted upon spits. Men and women alike lifted cups to gods and ancestors, to friends and family, to luck and harvest. Outside, snow lay deep upon fields, wind howled against turf walls, but inside, warmth glowed and laughter rose. Yule was both survival and celebration, a promise that winter would pass, that light would return. Summer too had its gatherings. After harvest, communities celebrated with feasts, giving thanks for grain stored, animals slaughtered, meadows cleared. At weddings, at births, at victories, the hall filled once more with music, stories, and food. In such moments, the hardships of life seemed softened. The rhythm of toil turned briefly into rhythm of joy. Feasts were more than food, they were rituals of community. A chieftain or wealthy farmer hosted, offering meat and drink to neighbors. In return, he gained loyalty and respect, for generosity was as important as strength. A man who gave freely was honored. A hall filled with laughter was a sign not only of joy, but of power. Hospitality was sacred. To deny a guest food or drink was to bring shame. Even strangers, arriving weary from travel, were welcomed, seated near the fire, given bread and ale before questions were asked. The food itself was simple, yet plentiful at such times. Roasted pork, beef, lamb, or goat, boiled stews thick with barley and beans, bread fresh from stone ovens, butter and cheese from cows and goats, fish salted or smoked. Honey cakes sweetened the table, fruit dried from summer, nuts gathered in autumn, ale brewed from barley, mead fermented with honey, sometimes even imported wine if traders had passed through. The table was wood, the bowls were simple, but the abundance was richness enough. Music and stories filled the hall. Skalds, the poets, recited sagas, their voices rising and falling with rhythm, their words carrying listeners into worlds of gods and heroes. Songs were sung, drums beaten, harps strummed, some danced, stamping feet upon floors, clapping hands in time. Children laughed, chasing one another, their faces flushed with warmth. Elders nodded, their eyes bright, their memories stirred by words and melodies. The feast was not noisy chaos, but layered harmony, a tapestry of voices, fire, and warmth, woven slowly through the night. Drinking carried its own rhythm. Horns passed hand to hand, each sip taken with a toast, each toast spoken with respect. To Odin, to Thor, to Freya, to ancestors, to absent friends, to good harvests, to safe voyages. Words mattered. A man's honor was shown not only in his deeds, but in his speech, in the toasts he gave, in the memory he kept alive with each raised horn. Ale softened voices, laughter grew, but beneath it was still a structure, a ritual, a steady rhythm of giving and receiving. Games were played, too. Men tested strength in wrestling, women joined in riddles and word games, children rolled dice carved from bone. Some games were quiet, some lively, all part of the joy of gathering. Outside, torches flickered against snow or grass, casting shadows across fields, marking the whole as the heart of the community. Imagine such a night. It is deep winter. Outside, snow lies heavy. The air is cold and still, the stars sharp above. Inside, the whole glows. Fire crackles in the hearth, light flickering across beams blackened with age. Tables are lined with food, roasted pork, bowls of stew, loaves of bread, horns of ale and mead are lifted. voices rising in toasts. A skald sings softly, his words weaving a story of Thor's journey, the listeners leaning closer, their faces lit by fire. A boy plays with a carved toy horse near the wall. A woman hums as she spins wool. Even in celebration, a man claps his friend upon the shoulder with laughter. The air is thick with warmth, with joy, with life. The feast stretches into the night. Songs are repeated, stories retold, ale poured again. Children fall asleep upon benches, wrapped in furs, their dreams filled with voices and firelight. Elders lean back, smiling faintly, remembering their own youth. Outside, wolves may howl in the distance, snow may drift upon the roof, but within, there is only light, warmth, and companionship. The hall becomes a world apart, timeless, patient, enduring. Festivals and feasts were not escapes from Viking life, but part of it. They gave balance to labor, meaning to hardship, joy to endurance. They reminded people that they were not only farmers, not only traders, not only sailors, but also a community bound by song, by story, by shared bread and drink. The slow joy of gathering was as necessary as the harvest, as vital as the voyage, as sacred as the gods. And so, as we picture them tonight, we see not warriors upon seas, nor farmers in fields, but families and neighbors gathered together, horns raised, fire glowing, voices murmuring. The hall breathes with warmth, the feast stretches on, the night deepens softly. This, too, was the Viking world, not only toil and voyage, but festival, feast, and the slow joy of gathering. The Vikings are remembered by many for their battles, the clashing of shields, the swing of axes, the cries upon the wind. Yet for those who lived through such days, the noise of battle was only a moment. What lingered longer, what shaped lives, for years, was the silence that followed, the fields after the fight, the halls where names were spoken quietly, the absence felt at hearths, where one voice no longer joined the evening songs. A Viking's life was not endless war, but war touched it often enough to leave marks upon memory. Some fought upon distant shores, raiding monasteries or clashing with kings. Others defended their own homes against rivals or invaders. The sagas speak of great victories, but the people themselves carried both pride and grief, remembering not only what was gained but also what was lost after a battle. The land itself bore witness. A field once green with grass lay trampled, darkened with earth disturbed by boots and hooves. Broken shields, splintered spears, discarded helmets lay scattered. Ravens circled overhead, their cries echoing across the quiet. Where noise had raged, stillness now settled. Survivors walked among the fallen, searching for kin, calling names softly. The sound of weeping, of sighs, of prayers whispered. These were the sounds of aftermath. The dead were honored with rituals. Some were buried in mounds, their weapons placed beside them, their ships sometimes drawn ashore and covered in earth, as if to carry them still upon voyages beyond life. Others were burned upon pyres, flames rising into the night, smoke drifting upward like souls ascending to the halls of the gods. The smell of smoke, the glow of embers, the hush of voices gathered all marked the passage of warriors from earth to memory. Families carried the weight most heavily. A mother waiting for a son who did not return, a wife speaking her husband's name quietly in prayer, children growing without fathers, listening to stories told by elders to keep the memory alive. The sagas told of heroes, but behind those tales lay countless unnamed, remembered only in silence, in tears shed by hearth fires, in offerings placed upon stones at the edge of fields. Victory was not always joyous, even in triumph. Lives were gone, blood had been spilled, grief lingered. A chieftain might gain land or treasure, but he also lost men whose names he knew, whose faces he had seen every day. Feasts followed battles, but even as horns were raised, silence hung heavy at certain places along the benches. Cups stood untouched, where men once sat. Yet from silence also came strength. The memory of the fallen bound communities together. Songs were sung in their honor, toasts given at feasts, runes carved upon stones. Their names lived on, spoken by children remembered, in stories. In this way, silence was not emptiness, but presence and echo of voices carried into the future. Imagine such an evening. A battle has ended days before. The survivors have returned to their village. The longhouse is filled, but quieter than before. The hearth burns, but its glow feels dimmer. A woman spins wool. Her face calm but her eyes distant. A man sharpens a blade slowly, his thoughts elsewhere. Children play softly, their laughter subdued, sensing the weight of the room. An elder speaks a saga, not of far-off gods, but of a man just buried. His deeds told gently, his name spoken with respect. The hall breathes, steady but heavy, a rhythm of endurance shaped by loss. The Vikings did not fear battle, but neither did they forget it. They carried its silence into their homes, their rituals, their stories. It shaped them as much as farming, as much as voyaging, as much as trade. Their world was not only one of noise, but of quiet fields after storms, quiet halls after feasts, quiet memories after battles. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see the clash of steel or the cries of war. We see the stillness after, the ravens circling, the families gathered, the fire glowing faintly. We hear voices murmuring names. We feel the weight of absence. We rest in the silence that follows. This, too, was the Viking life. Not only noise, but remembrance. Not only struggle, but silence. The Vikings are remembered as raiders and wanderers. Yet their world was not ruled only by sword and sail. Beneath the voyages, beneath the battles, lay a structure of law, custom, and assembly. They were not an empire, not bound by one king or one council, but they carried with them traditions of justice that guided their lives, both at home and abroad. Their law was spoken, not written, remembered in minds, carried in voices, recited in gatherings where community came together beneath open skies. The foundation of Viking law was the thing an assembly of free men, held at intervals in valleys, fields, or near sacred stones. These gatherings were more than councils. They were the heartbeat of society. Here disputes were settled, agreements sworn, punishments declared. Each free man had the right to speak, to raise his voice before neighbors, to call witnesses, to seek judgment. Women, too, though not voting members, influenced through presence, through kin, through bonds of family. The thing was not only law, it was community. Imagine such a gathering. The day is bright, the air cool. Men walk from farms and villages, cloaks upon their shoulders, staffs in hand. They gather upon a grassy plain, near a great stone or under an ancient tree. The law speaker, chosen for his knowledge, steps forward. His voice is clear, steady, carrying words learned by heart. He recites laws slowly, each phrase measured, each pause deliberate. There are no scrolls, no books, only memory and rhythm. The people listen, nodding, murmuring. The words are not you, but they are binding, reminders of order carried through generations. Disputes are heard. One man accuses another of theft, perhaps a cow taken, perhaps timber cut from the wrong forest. Witnesses step forward, voices calm, telling what they saw. The assembly listens. Judgment is given, compensation declared. It is not revenge that rules, but balance. Payment for harm, silver or goods exchanged to restore peace. To refuse was to risk feud, to shatter community. To accept was to honor law, to bind wounds with fairness. Oaths were central. A man's word was more than speech, it was bond sealed before witnesses, spoken with hand upon sacred ring or upon hilt of sword. To break an oath was not only shameful, but dangerous. For honor was the fabric of society. Without trust, no voyage could be launched, no marriage agreed, no trade completed. Oaths were spoken slowly, carefully, with weight. A promise once given lingered in memory, carried in whispers, binding more surely than chains. Punishments varied. Theft might be repaid with silver, wounds with compensation. In grave cases, exile could be declared, a man cast out from community. no longer protected by law, vulnerable to any hand. Death was rare, for exile was often worse, stripping a man of kin and shelter, leaving him adrift in a world where to be without community was to be alone. The law was not static, it was alive, shifting with needs, with disputes, with generations. It carried fragments of myth and faith, blending sacred and practical. Some saw Odin's wisdom in its fairness, Thor's strength in its enforcement, Freya's grace in its protection of kin. Yet above all, it was human, a weaving of voices, of judgments, of memories repeated until they became structure. Even in distant settlements, far from Scandinavia, the law traveled. In Iceland, the Althing was founded, one of the oldest assemblies known, where chieftains and farmers gathered each summer in the open air. There, under cliffs and beside rivers, laws were spoken, disputes settled, agreements made. The Althing endured for centuries, shaping a society upon volcanic shores where kings held no sway, but law and memory ruled. The thing was also a place of gathering beyond law. Families came, markets formed, goods exchanged, marriages arranged. It was both court and festival, both judgment and celebration. Songs were sung, tales told, children played as elders debated. It was not grim, but rhythmic, part of the slow balance of life. Picture such an assembly at twilight. The disputes of the day are settled, silver exchanged, hands clasped in agreement. Men gather near fires, speaking softly, their voices carrying. In the cool air, women weave at the edge, their looms clicking gently, their eyes watching, their ears listening. Children chase one another through the grass, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flames. The law speaker sits quietly, his task done, his memory holding words for another day. The sky darkens, stars emerge, the assembly rests. Justice has been spoken, not in thunder, but in calm voices, measured and patient. This was Viking law, neither chaos nor tyranny, but community. It was not perfect, but it was enduring, a reminder that even in a world of restless seas and sharp blades, people sought balance, order, fairness. They knew that strength alone could not hold society. It was trust, oath, memory, and voice that bound them. And so, as we drift with them tonight, we see not warriors upon waves, nor raiders upon shores, but neighbors gathered in fields, listening to law, speaking their truth, accepting judgment. The thing breathes with silence, with rhythm, with endurance. It is another face of the Viking world, not only axe and sail, but also assembly, oath, and quiet justice. When we think of Viking gods, we may imagine thunder crashing, lightning splitting mountains, or fierce warriors lifting hammers in storm. Yet for the people who lived in villages, who worked fields, who mended nets, the gods were not distant figures of only grand drama. They were near, quiet, woven into the daily rhythm of life. Their presence was not always in battle or spectacle, but in small acts, in whispers of prayer, in offerings left upon stones, in faith lived beneath northern skies. The Viking world was filled with gods and spirits. Odin, one-eyed and wise, who sacrificed his eye for knowledge and hung upon the world tree for runes. Thor, strong and steady, protector of mankind. His hammer Mjolnir blessing marriages, as well as striking giants. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and beauty, who wept golden tears. Njord, god of the sea, bringing calm winds for voyages. Freyr, giver of harvests, worshipped in fields for fertility of crops, and countless others. Heimdall, watcher of the rainbow, bridged Balder, shining and gentle. Loki, trickster and shapeshifter. Each had stories sung in sagas, each had myths told by firelight. But in daily life they were more than characters. They were companions, invisible but near. Faith was not confined to temples. In fact, most Viking worship was simple, intimate, woven into routines of survival. A farmer, before sowing barley, might place a small sheaf of last year's grain upon a stone, whispering to Freyr for blessing. A fisherman, before casting nets, might murmur to Njord for calm seas, or to Ran, the sea goddess who caught sailors in her net, asking her to spare his voyage. A mother, before feeding her child, might glance toward a carved figure on the shelf, offering thanks for health. Faith was not grand ceremony, but constant presence. Still, there were sacred places, groves of oak or ash, where trees rose high, their branches whispering in wind, stones weathered and ancient, standing upright in fields, marked with runes, or stained with offerings, waterfalls and springs, bubbling with power, thought to hold spirits. These were not vast temples, but nature itself turned sacred. The gods were not far away in heaven, they were in the thunder above fjords, in the harvest of barley, in the seal caught at sea, in the fire glowing in the hearth. Sacrifices were part of this rhythm, animals offered at seasonal feasts, cattle, goats, pigs, sometimes their blood sprinkled upon stones, their meat shared in community. In larger gatherings called blot, whole communities came together, honoring gods with both ritual and feast. But sacrifice was not only animals, it could be as simple as bread cast into fire, a cup of ale poured upon the ground, a piece of silver left upon a stone. Each act carried weight, reminding the people that they lived in balance, receiving and giving, bound to the divine by exchange. Runes, too, carried spiritual presence, carved not only for memory, but for blessing and protection. A rune scratched upon wood before a voyage, a charm carved into bone for health, a name etched upon stone to keep it alive. To carve was to pray with hands, to whisper with knife, to bind the unseen into the seen. Faith was part of milestones as well. Birth was blessed by goddesses of fertility. Marriage was sanctified beneath Thor's hammer, lifted over the bride and groom. Death carried souls not into void but into halls, Valhalla for the brave, Fokvanger with Freya for others, hell for many, quiet and steady. The afterlife was not feared as emptiness, but accepted as passage, one way or another into another. Hall, another gathering. Imagine such a day, a spring morning in a Viking village. The snow has melted, fields are soft with new growth. A farmer walks to the edge of his field, carrying a small basket of barley. He kneels before a stone worn smooth by generations. He places the first handful of seed upon it, his hand resting for a moment, his voice whispering thanks to Freyr. The sun glows faintly through clouds, a bird calls from the forest. The soil feels damp beneath his knees. He rises, returns to his field, begins to sow. The gods are not thunder above, but presence beside, woven into his act. Or imagine a fisherman preparing for voyage. His boat rests upon shore, nets coiled, sail folded. Before he pushes into water, he tosses a piece of bread into the sea, murmuring to Ran, asking her not to stay open, not to catch him. He feels the wind upon his face, the salt upon his lips. The sea is vast, restless, dangerous, but in his gesture, he feels balance, a bond with the unseen. At night, in the longhouse, Faith continues. Children sit near the hearth, listening to stories of Thor and Loki, of Odin's wisdom, of Baldur's light. Their eyes widen at giants, at magic, at trickery. They fall asleep with gods alive in their dreams. A mother tucks her child beneath furs, her hand brushing a small wooden carving upon the wall, a quiet prayer upon her lips. The hall is dim, the fire flickers. Outside the stars glow. Faith is not loud, not heavy, it is soft, constant, a hum beneath life. The Vikings did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. The two were woven like threads in cloth. Each day was lived with gods near, in field, in sea, in hall. To us, their myths may seem distant stories, but to them, they were companions, as real as stone and soil. Their faith was not only in great battles, not only in distant Valhalla, but in daily acts of patience and endurance, in whispers, in offerings, in quiet moments beneath northern skies. And so, as we imagine them tonight, we do not hear thunder or clash of battle. We hear a farmer whispering at dawn, a fisherman tossing bread into waves, a mother murmuring by firelight. We see the gods not far above, but ne'er woven into wind, into soil, into flame. Faith breathes softly steady, rhythm as endless as the sea, as patient as the stars. The sea carries many stories, and among the longest of them is the story of the Vikings' westward voyages. Beyond the Shetlands, beyond the Faroes, lay a land whispered of by sailors, Iceland. A place of smoke and stone, of glaciers and valleys, of fire that rose from the earth and frost that never truly left. To reach it was to cross restless waters, but to settle there was to begin anew, upon so strange and raw a land that seemed both harsh and full of promise. The first Norse voyagers to sight Iceland did so almost by accident. Some were blown off course, their sails caught by winds pushing them farther west than they intended. They saw its coasts, black and rugged, lined with cliffs and capped with glaciers. Steam rose from hot springs, birds wheeled above cliffs, seals basked upon rocks. To many, it seemed a strange land, neither wholly welcoming nor wholly forbidding. Yet curiosity grew, word spread among sailors. There was land far across the sea, empty of kings, free for those who dared. By the late 9th century, ships began to set out with purpose. Families packed their long ships not only with warriors, but with sheep, cattle, goats, and horses. They carried timber for building, grain for planting, tools for farming. They left fjords behind, seeking not treasure this time, but freedom land of their own, without overlords, without taxes demanded by distant rulers. Iceland became a promise of independence. The voyage itself was long and difficult. From Norway, they sailed northwest, often stopping first in the Shetlands or Faroes, to rest, repair, and trade, then onward, across open sea. The wind could be cruel, waves high, fog heavy. Days stretched with no land in sight, only gulls, only stars at night, only the endless breath of waves. The crew rowed when wind failed, their muscles weary, their hands blistered. Families huddled beneath cloaks, children restless, animals shifting uneasily in the ship's hold. Yet the ship pressed on, guided by stars, by sun, by instinct. At last, Iceland rose from the horizon. To the weary, it must have seemed otherworldly. Black volcanic beaches, mountains capped with snow, valleys green with grass in summer. Air smelled of sulfur, steam rising from geysers and springs. Rivers rushed, waterfalls thundered, seabirds cried overhead. The settlers beached their ships, stepping ashore upon new land, their boots sinking into dark sand. For a moment there was silence, then voices rose, prayers whispered, hands lifted in thanks. They had arrived. The first task was shelter. Timber was scarce, for Iceland held few trees. Builders turned instead to turf, cutting thick blocks of grassy earth, stacking them into walls, roofing with more turf and driftwood carried by sea. These turf houses were low and sturdy, their walls green, their interiors warm when fires burned inside. Life was much like in Scandinavia. Hearths glowed, benches lined the walls. Furs kept families warm. Yet outside, the land was different, starker, wilder, raw. Farms spread slowly along coasts and valleys. Sheep grazed upon hills, their wool vital for clothing. Goats and cattle were tended, though winters were hard and fodder scarce. Barley was planted, but harvests were uncertain. For summers were short, soil thin. Fishing became lifeblood. Cod, pulled from seas, dried in wind, stored for winter. Whales sometimes washed ashore, their meat and blubber blessings. In hardship, families endured, learning the rhythm of this strange land. Communities grew, though scattered. Without kings, settlers governed themselves. Chieftains held sway, but assemblies, things bound people by law, as they had at home. By 930, the Althing was founded, one of the world's earliest parliaments, where free men gathered each summer to recite laws, settle disputes, arrange marriages, trade goods, and share news. Beneath open sky, with mountains watching and rivers flowing nearby, they built a society upon freedom and law, a balance between hardship and endurance. Life in Iceland was marked by contrasts. Winters long, dark, Cold, the sun vanishing for weeks, summers short, bright filled with endless daylight. Fire beneath the earth, in hot springs and volcanoes, meeting ice upon glaciers. Silence of valleys broken by thunder of waterfalls. For settlers, this was not only challenge but wonder. They told stories of gods and giants walking in the land's strange forms. They saw Thor's strength in eruptions, Odin's wisdom in the silence of glaciers, Freya's beauty in brief blossoms upon meadows. The land itself seemed alive, sacred, eternal. Imagine such a settlement in its first years. A turf house stands, low against wind, its roof green with grass. Smoke rises from a hearth, drifting into pale sky. Sheep graze nearby, their wool thick. A woman weaves wool inside, her spindle turning slowly. A man repairs a net, his fingers deft, his eyes steady. Children chase one another near a stream, their laughter soft against the rush of water. The sea glitters beyond, waves steady, gulls circling. The land is harsh, yet it holds life, and within it, a community breathes slowly, enduring, growing. The sagas, written later, preserved these memories. They told of men and women who left Norway, who sailed west, who claimed land in Iceland. They told of feuds and friendships, of winters endured, of farms built, of laws spoken at the alding. They remembered hardship, but also freedom. In Iceland, there were no kings to command, only law and community. For many, it was worth the struggle. The Vikings reached many shores. But Iceland was different. It was not merely a place to raid, not merely a camp between voyages, but a homeland born anew. It became a land of sagas, of poetry, of memory. It shaped not only their lives, but their stories, carrying their voices far into the future. And so, as we picture them tonight, see not raiders upon seas, but settlers upon land. A turf house glowing in twilight, a hearth burning, voices murmuring, sheep grazing, rivers rushing. The land of fire and frost surrounds them, vast and silent, yet within it, life endures. Slowly, patiently, they have settled. Iceland has become home. The sea has always carried wanderers farther than they planned, and the Vikings were no exception. After settling in Iceland, some looked still westward, where the horizon stretched empty and gray. Sailors whispered of lands beyond, distant coasts glimpsed through mist, shores of rock and ice. Some came by chance, blown off course by storm. Others came with purpose, seeking land, freedom, and hope. Thus the Vikings reached Greenland, a place of fjords and glaciers, of harsh winters and brief summers, of silence deeper than any they had known. The story begins with Eric the Red, banished from Iceland after feuds turned violent. Exile was punishment worse than death for many a man, cut off from community, cast out into uncertainty. Yet exile also pushed him upward, sailing westward. Eric came upon great lands, coasts of ice and stone, yet with fjords where grass grew in summer, where sheep might graze, where men might build. He called it Greenland, a name chosen with hope, meant to draw others to follow, and they did. By the late 10th century, ships carried families from Iceland to Greenland. Their longships were packed with livestock, cows, sheep, goats, horses, as well as timber, tools, grain, and goods. The voyage was long and perilous. Between Iceland and Greenland lay the open North Atlantic, restless with fog and storm, strewn with icebergs drifting silently, glittering white in sun, threatening in shadow. The sailors watched the water constantly, steering carefully to avoid disaster. They rowed when winds failed, huddled beneath cloaks when rains fell, whispered prayers, endured, to Ran, to Thor. Some ships never arrived, swallowed by sea and ice, but those that did found fjords where land met water, places where settlement was possible. The Greenland settlements were never many, perhaps a few thousand people at their height. Two main clusters formed, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortok, and the western settlement farther north. Between them lay hundreds of kilometers of rugged coast, fjords deep, mountains rising, glaciers glistening. The settlers built farms along fjords, where grass grew in short summers, enough to feed cattle and sheep. They cut turf and stone for houses, built barns for animals, fields for hay. Each farm was small, yet together they formed a community, scattered but enduring. Life in Greenland was hard. Winters long, dark, bitterly cold, snow piled high, seas froze, winds howled, summers brief, yet filled with labor, hay cut and stored. Animals grazed, fish caught, seals hunted. Whales, when stranded upon shores, were blessings, their meat and blubber feeding families, their bones used for building in tools. Hunting was as vital as farming caribou, seals, birds. Fish all part of survival. The people endured weaving wool into warm cloth, carving bone and ivory into tools, storing every scrap of food they could gather. Trade linked Greenland to the wider world. Each summer, ships sailed back to Iceland, to Norway carrying walrus ivory, furs, sealskins, sometimes falcons prized in European courts. In return came iron, timber, cloth, grain, things Greenland could not produce, though isolated. They were never cut off. They were threads at the edge of a vast web, binding distant lands through patient voyages. Religion followed them too. Churches were built of stone, small yet steady, their walls standing even today in ruins. Christianity had reached Greenland, brought by missionaries and settlers alike. Still, beneath the new faith, older traditions lingered. People whispered to old gods as well as new, carving runes, making offerings, blending belief with endurance. Imagine such a settlement, a small farm beside a fjord. A turf house stands low, smoke rising from its chimney. Sheep graze nearby, their wool thick. Cows stand in a barn, chewing hay. A man mends nets upon the shore, his hands slow but steady. A woman spins wool, her spindle turning as she hums softly. Children chase one another across grass, their laughter carried by wind. Beyond them rises the glacier, white and silent, gleaming in sun. The sea glitters with ice, small bergs drifting past, gulls circling overhead. It is not abundance, but it is life, patient, enduring, steady. The Greenland settlements lasted for centuries. Though always fragile, storms grew harsher, winters colder, trade routes weaker, yet for generations, people lived there, were born, married, buried, their stories woven into the land. Even when they vanished, their ruins remained, walls of stone, churches empty, farms silent. They are reminders of courage and patience, of human will to endure at the very edge of the known world. Greenland was not conquest, but settlement, not raid, but survival, not noise, but silence. And in that silence, families lived, worked, prayed, and dreamed. To us, it may seem barren. To them, it was home. And so, as we imagine them tonight, we see not warriors upon seas, but farmers beside fjords. We see sheep grazing, smoke rising, nets drying. We hear voices murmuring softly, children laughing gently, the sea sighing beyond. On them rise glaciers, eternal and cold, yet within their homes warmth glows, life endures, even at the edge of the known world. By the end of the 10th century, the sea had carried the Vikings farther than most people of their age could imagine. From Norway to England, from Denmark to Francia, from Iceland to Greenland, they had crossed fjords, rivers, and open oceans. Yet still their gaze pushed westward, to horizons where no European had yet placed foot. Sailors whispered of coasts beyond Greenland, lands with trees, with wild grapes, with gentle valleys. They called it Vinland. The story belongs to Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who led settlers to Greenland. Leif heard from sailors who had been blown off course and sighted strange shores farther west. Curious and bold, he gathered a crew, set sail from Greenland, and after days upon restless seas, sighted land. To the weary sailors, it must have seemed dreamlike. Hills green with forests, rivers running clear, fields rich with grass. After the starkness of Greenland, Vinland seemed abundant, a land of promise. The Vikings built small camps along these coasts, places where ships could rest, where men could hunt and gather. They cut timber, precious after the treelessness of Iceland and Greenland. They fished rivers heavy with salmon. They found grapes, or perhaps berries mistaken for grapes, which gave the land its name. To them, Vinland was gentle compared to the harshness of home, yet they did not settle for long. The sagas tell of encounters with the skirling jar, the indigenous peoples of North America. At first, there was trade furs for iron. Goods exchanged in curiosity, but tensions grew. Vikings, few in number, could not stand against larger groups. Skirmishes broke out, arrows flew, shouts echoed in forests. The Norse withdrew uneasy, their camps abandoned. Vinland was rich, but it was not theirs to claim. Still, the memory lingered. For a time, ships returned, carrying timber, carrying stories. Settlements may have been attempted, small and fragile, but none endured more than a few years. By the early 11th century, the Vikings left Vinland behind, their focus turning once more to Greenland, Iceland, and Europe. Yet they had touched North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They had crossed farther west than any other people of their world. Archaeologists in Newfoundland, at a place called Land's Ox Meadows, have found traces of these footsteps, foundations of timber halls, iron nails forged in Viking style, evidence of a camp built and left. These remains are quiet, but they speak clearly. The Vikings were there for a moment. Their world touched another continent. What must it have felt like to stand upon those shores? Imagine it. The ship sliding onto sand, the men stepping out, their boots sinking into soil unlike home. Around them trees rise tall, the air rich with scents of pine and earth. Birds call from branches, rivers rush nearby, salmon leap against currents. The grass is green, the hills gentle, the sky wide. For those who came from Greenland's glaciers, it must have seemed paradise. They build a small hall of timber, smoke curling from its roof. Women stir pots of fish stew, men stack logs, children chase one another in grass. For a time, it feels like a home, but nights bring unease. Strange sounds echo in the forest, voices, perhaps, or the crack of branches. The settlers huddle inside, their fire burning low, their ears straining. They know they are not alone. The land is rich, but it belongs to others. In the end, they leave, their ships sliding once more into the sea, their voices fading into waves. Vinland remained more memory than settlement, more dream than reality. Yet its presence in sagas kept it alive. Generations told of Leif the Lucky, who crossed farther than any before, who saw a land of grapes and salmon, who built halls upon a distant shore. The story traveled across centuries, carried quietly, until rediscovered by scholars and proven by ruins. For the Vikings themselves, Vinland was not a conquest. It was an echo, a glimpse, a brief footprint upon soil far from home. They did not stay, but they had seen. They did not conquer, but they had touched. And in that touch, the world grew larger for them, and for us. And so, as we picture them, tonight, we do not see warriors raiding, nor settlers plowing. We see a small camp beside a river, smoke rising, salmon caught, timber cut. We see men resting upon benches, women tending fires, children playing in grass. We hear gulls above, rivers rushing, wind sighing through trees. The whole glows softly, a fragile light in vast wilderness. Vinland breathes, for a moment, with quiet life. Not all Viking voyages were westward into misty seas. Some turned their prows east, into the wide rivers that cut through forests and plains, carrying them deep into the heart of Europe and beyond. These men became known as the Varangians, Norse travelers and traders who rode silently along waterways, linking the Baltic with the Black Sea and, in time, with the golden domes of Byzantium. Their journeys were not raids alone, but long threads of commerce, of settlement, of patient rowing. Upon endless rivers. The rivers of the east were their highways. From the Baltic, they entered the Neva, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Volga. Each river carried them farther into forests thick with birch and pine, across lakes vast and silent. Through plains stretching wide and quiet, their longships, light and shallow, were made for such travel. They slid over sandbars, slipped into narrow channels, could even be hauled across land where rivers did not meet. Oars dipped in silence, sails rose in open stretches, voices murmured low as trees whispered overhead. These voyages were long, sometimes lasting months. Men rowed patiently, their backs bending, their arms aching, but the rhythm of oars kept steady. They carried goods for trade, furs of sable and fox, walrus ivory, amber from the Baltic, slaves captured in raids. In return they sought silver, silk, wine, spices. Their ships became moving markets, their journeys threads that tied together distant worlds along the rivers. They built settlements. Novgorod, at first a trading post, became a thriving town, a place where Norse and Slavic peoples mingled, where languages blended, where goods changed hands. Further south, Kiev rose as another great center, controlling the Dnieper route to the Black Sea. These were not only camps of raiders, but communities of families, farmers, traders, warriors, a mixture of north and east, woven together by rivers. The Varangians were remembered in chronicles not only as traders but as rulers. Local Slavic peoples sometimes invited them to bring order, to rule fairly, to defend against rivals. The famous invitation to come and rule us gave rise to dynasties, the beginnings of what would one day become Russia. The line of Rurik, a Norse chieftain, stretched across centuries, its roots in Viking prows upon rivers. Their voyages carried them to Byzantium itself, the great city of Constantinople. To the Norse, it was Miklagard, the great city. Its walls shone white, its domes glistened, its markets overflowed with goods beyond imagination. Varangian traders docked their ships in its harbors, their voices mixing with Greek, Arabic, Slavic. Some stayed, some entered the service of the Byzantine emperor, forming the Varangian Guard, warriors sworn to protect the throne. These men, tall and strong, were famed for loyalty, their axes feared, their presence a reminder that Vikings had reached the very heart of empire. Yet if we listen closely, we hear not the noise of empire, but the silence of rivers. Imagine them, a line of longships moving slowly through forested channels. Oars dip in rhythm, their splash the only sound. Mist drifts upon the water, birds rise from reeds, fish dart beneath hulls. Men row steadily, their breath visible in cold air, their cloaks pulled tight. Children sit near the stern, their eyes wide, watching forests slide past. Women mend nets, spin wool, stir small pots. The river carries them onward, patient, endless, steady. At night, they beach their ships upon grassy banks. Fires are lit, meat roasted, voices murmur in many tongues. Traders from nearby villages arrive, bringing honey, grain, furs. Deals are made, hands clasped, goods exchanged. Above, the stars glitter, the river reflects them faintly. The night hums with insects and owls. Sleep comes slowly, wrapped in cloaks, the ships resting like shadows beside water. The Varangian story is one of connection. They did not conquer Byzantium, nor did they erase the cultures they met. Instead, they mingled, traded, settled, intermarried. They left behind words, names, customs. They brought back silk and silver, stories of golden domes, songs of southern lands. They were both strangers and kin, wanderers and settlers, oarsmen and rulers. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see fierce raiders upon stormy seas, but patient rowers upon quiet rivers. We see ships sliding through mist, villages rising along banks, markets humming with exchange. We hear oars dipping, voices murmuring, water flowing endlessly. The Varangians remind us that the Viking world was not only one of battle, but of journey, of commerce, of silence upon rivers that carried them farther than they had ever dreamed. The rivers carried the Vikings far from their fjords, into lands of forests and plains, into markets of honey and fur, and at last into the shining city of Constantinople. To the Norse, it was Miklagard, the great city. Its marble walls and golden domes were unlike anything they had ever seen. Here, beneath the blazing sun of the south, men from the cold north found new purpose. Some came as traders, some as wanderers, but many came as warriors, offering their service to the Emperor of Byzantium. They became known as the Varangian, guard foreign protectors, bound not by birth but by oath, wielding axes in silence, their loyalty as enduring as stone. The Byzantine emperors valued them for their strength and, above all, for their trustworthiness. In a world where palace intrigues often turned allies into rivals, the Varangians were strangers to the tangled webs of local politics. They had no kin in Byzantium, no stake in conspiracies, no claim to the throne. Their loyalty was simple and clear, to the emperor alone. For this reason, they were prized as bodyguards, defenders, and enforcers. They stood in shining halls with axes at rest, their silence heavy with meaning. The Varangians carried with them the weapons of their homeland. Most famous was the great two-handed axe, long-shafted, wide-bladed, capable of cleaving through shield and armor alike. In their hands, it was more than a tool of war, it was a symbol of presence. When the emperor passed through crowded streets, the guard marched before him, axes gleaming in sunlight, their steps measured, their faces stern. The people parted at their sight, for they carried with them not only power but also the mystery of far-off lands. Yet their service was not only ceremonial. The Varangians fought in battles across the empire, in campaigns against Arabs, Bulgars, Normans. They marched through Anatolia, sailed the Mediterranean, guarded the emperor in wars and peace alike. In battle, they were fierce, unyielding, their axes biting, their shields steady. Chroniclers spoke of them as the emperor's wine barrels, for they drank heavily, yet when battle came, they fought with unmatched ferocity. Life in the guard, however, was not only blood and steel. Between campaigns, they lived in Constantinople, the greatest city they had ever known. They walked its streets, wide and bustling, filled with markets selling silks, spices, perfumes. They saw mosaics glittering in Hagia Sophia, candles burning in golden light, incense drifting in air. They heard bells ring, choirs sing, voices in languages they did not understand, to men from turf houses and wooden halls. It must have seemed a dream, a place of endless marvel. And yet, within this wonder, they carried their own customs. In barracks, they carved runes into walls and beams. They sang northern songs by firelight. They lifted horns of wine, telling stories of fjords, of voyages, of gods and ancestors. They were far from home, but they did not forget it. Their loyalty bound them to the emperor, but their memory bound them to the north. Imagine such a moment. It is evening in Constantinople. The sun has set, its glow lingering upon domes and walls. Inside a great hall, the emperor feasts, courtiers murmuring, candles flickering. At the edges of the hall stand the Varangians, tall and silent, axes resting against shoulders. Their eyes are steady, their cloaks heavy, their presence unmistakable. They do not speak, but their silence is enough. It is a wall stronger than stone, a promise that the emperor is safe. Outside, in quieter quarters, the guard rests. Fires burn low, men sit upon benches, carving wood, mending weapons, drinking slowly. One hums the song of Norway, another tells a story of Iceland, another speaks of Greenland's fjords. They are far from home, yet together, bound by shared service, by the oaths sworn. Children sleep in distant villages, wives tend farms across seas, but here in this city, they endure as one. Service in the guard was often long, sometimes lifelong. Yet many returned home eventually, their arms heavy with wealth, gold, silver, silks, treasures from Byzantine markets. Some built halls greater than their fathers had known, their wealth sung in sagas. Others were remembered simply as men who had seen the world's heart, who had stood before emperors, who had carried axes in silence. The Varangian Guard was more than soldiers. They were bridges between worlds, the north and the south, the simple and the grand, The turf house and the golden dome, in them we see how far the Vikings traveled, not only in distance, but in presence. They became part of another empire's story even as they carried their own, and so, as we imagine them tonight, we do not hear the clash of battle. We hear the silence of guards in a candlelit hall, axes resting, eyes watching. We see them standing steady, unmoving, loyal. We see them in barracks, murmuring songs of home. We feel the weight of their oaths, the patience of their service, the quiet strength that bound them to emperors beneath foreign skies. No image of the Vikings is more enduring than that of their ships. Long, slender, shallow, they were both tools and symbols, the body of exploration, the path of trade, the shadow of raids, the vessel of migration. To the Vikings, the ship was not merely wood and sail. It was life itself, an extension of the village, a floating hall, a silent companion upon endless seas. It carried them to Iceland, to Greenland, to Vinland. It bore them along rivers to Novgorod and Kiev, to the golden domes of Byzantium. It was their wings upon water, their footprints upon horizon. Without ships, there would be no Viking story. The Viking longship was crafted with care, each plank fitted with patience, each rib shaped by knowledge passed from father to son. Builders split oak into planks, overlapping them in a technique called clinker construction. Iron rivets bound the wood, tar-sealed seams, wool soaked in pitch kept water out. The hull was light but strong, bending with waves, gliding over shallow rivers, steady upon deep seas. The prow rose in dragon heads or serpent curves, carved with fierce faces to frighten spirits and enemies alike. Yet even in their fierceness, they carried grace lines so clean, so balanced, that centuries later they are still admired as perfect vessels of their age. The longship's gift was its versatility. It could sail with the wind or row against it. Its shallow draft allowed it to slip into rivers, to beach upon shores, to vanish as quickly as it appeared. It could carry warriors and raids, but also families, livestock, goods. Some ships were small, built for fjords and coasts. Others were great, carrying hundreds of men, crossing oceans. The Nair, broader and sturdier, was built for trade, its belly wide for cargo. The Drakkar, long and swift, was built for war, its dragon prow cutting through waves with silent menace. Together, they gave the Vikings wings of wood and sail. Life aboard was not comfortable, but it was constant. There were no cabins, no shelter. Men sat upon benches, rowing hour after hour, their bodies bent, their breath steady. When the sail was raised, they rested, but still the ship needed tending. Ropes pulled, tiller steered, mast adjusted. They ate dried fish, bread, cheese, sometimes meat, drinking ale or water stored in barrels. At night, they slept where they sat, wrapped in cloaks, shields propped as shelter, stars above their only roof. Rain fell, waves splashed, winds tore, yet they endured, their ship steady beneath them. Their rhythm matched to the seas. The sound of a longship was not noise, but rhythm. The creak of wood, the splash of oars, the snap of sail, the murmur of voices. When dozens of ships moved together, the horizon filled with their rhythm, a silent fleet gliding across water. To those upon shore, their sudden appearance was both awe and fear, shapes rising from mist, sails striped, prows carved, oars dipping steadily. Yet to those aboard, it was simply life, the patient endurance of voyage. Navigation was an art as much as skill. They watched the sun's arc, the stars, positions, the flight of birds, the drift of clouds, the color of water. Some carried sunstones, crystals, that caught light even through clouds, guiding direction. They learned the currents, the winds, the habits of whales and gulls. Their knowledge was memory, repeated in stories, taught in silence, handed from one sailor to another. Without compass, without map, they crossed oceans, reaching Iceland, Greenland, Vinland. Their ships were not only wood, but wisdom, shaped by centuries of observation. Imagine such a voyage, dawn upon the North Sea. Mist drifts across water, the horizon pale with light. A long ship moves steadily, its sails striped in red and brown swelling with wind. Oars dip in rhythm, splashing softly. Men sit upon benches, cloaks wrapped tight, their faces calm. A boy watches gulls circle overhead. A woman adjusts baskets of goods. A man sharpens a knife slowly. The ship glides, silent but alive, its dragon head cutting mist. Behind, the sea whispers. Ahead, horizon stretches endless dotted night. The ship is beached upon sand. A fire burns near shore, smoke curling into dark sky. Men mend nets, women stir pots, children chase one another in grass. The ship rests upon beach, its hull dark against starlight. Its prow rising like a shadow, the sea murmurs, waves rolling. Gently, in silence, in rhythm, the voyage continues. The ship was not only transport, but sacred. In burial, some were laid in ships, their bodies resting within hulls, surrounded by weapons, tools, goods. Earth was piled above, forming mounds that still rise upon Scandinavian fields. To be buried in a ship was to carry the soul onward, across the sea of death, into halls beyond. The ship was vessel in life, vessel in death, vessel in eternity. The sagas remember ships not only as tools but as companions. They are named, sung of, praised, the sea stallion, the long serpent. The now of Iceland. They carried stories as much as people. To speak of a voyage was to speak also of the ship, for the two were never separate. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see war alone, nor raids upon foreign shores. We see ships upon water, sails swelling, oars dipping, prows rising. We see men and women, children and goods, all carried patiently. We hear wood creak, water splash, wind sigh. We feel the rhythm of voyage, the silence of horizon. The presence of ships that were more than wood, more than tools. They were the very soul of the Vikings, silent sails upon endless horizons. When we think of the Vikings, we often imagine sails and axes, voyages and battles. Yet their world was also filled with quiet beauty, patterns traced into wood, animals shaped into iron, stories carved upon stone. Their art was not loud, not vast like Roman statues or Byzantine mosaics. It was intimate, intricate, woven into daily life. Every carved beam, every ornament upon a brooch, every rune upon a stone carried memory and meaning. Through art, the Vikings told their stories not always in words, but in lines, in curves, in silent patterns that endure still today. The Vikings lived surrounded by wood. Their houses were built of it, their ships carved from it, their tools shaped by it, and so naturally, their art was often born from wood as well. Carvers worked with knives and chisels, tracing interlacing patterns of beasts and knots, dragons twined with serpents, birds curved with flowing wings, lines looping endlessly, as though to capture eternity itself. The style is known now as the Viking animal style, figures elongated, woven together almost as if one creature becomes another, as if life is not separate but connected. These carvings adorned ships' prows, hull beams, door frames, even small wooden spoons and combs. Art was not only for temples or kings, it was for daily life, for the objects one touched each day. Stone too carried their stories. Rune stones stood in fields and by roadsides, raised in memory of the dead or in honor of deeds. Upon them, carvers etched runes, simple and angular, words of remembrance. Thorstein raised this stone in memory of his father, but alongside the words, patterns spread, serpents curling, dragons twisting, crosses mingling with old symbols. As Christianity came, each stone was both marker and art, a voice given to stone, a story rooted in earth. Some stones were small, seen only by villagers, others towered, their carvings catching sunlight, their presence felt by travelers passing along roads. They were silent storytellers, their voices carried in lines and loops. Metalwork, too, bore art, brooches shaped like animals, rings twisted in silver, axes engraved with lines, helmets decorated with interlacing forms. Even weapons, though built for war, carried beauty. A sword might bear a hilt inlaid with silver and bronze, its pommel carved with knots. The shield might be painted with swirling forms, its wood alive with color and symbol. To the Vikings, art was not apart from function. It was woven into it, inseparable. To carve a tool was to give it presence, to make it more than mere matter. Their ships were canvases as well. The dragon prows that frightened enemies also spoke of pride, of craftsmanship, of spirit, each prow unique, each curve shaped by hand, each detail meant to carry both beauty and power. When ships sailed across mist, their carved heads seemed alive creatures leading men across endless horizons. Imagine a Viking hall. Beams rise above, their surfaces darkened by smoke but carved with winding beasts. Door frames curve with knotwork, their patterns endless, looping patient. Upon the wall hangs a shield, its face painted with bright red spirals. A brooch clasps a woman's cloak, its silver shining in firelight, its surface etched with tiny animals. A child holds a comb of carved bone, its teeth neat, its handle shaped like a bird. Everywhere, art breathes, not grand, not overwhelming, but close, intimate, steady. Their art also carried belief. The intertwining forms spoke of a world connected, gods, humans, animals, all threads in the same pattern. The runes carved upon wood or stone held power, each line a symbol alive with meaning. To carve was not only to decorate, but to bless, to bind, to remember. Art was a prayer made visible, a story made touchable, a voice given form. The sagas tell of poets who shaped words, but carvers shaped silence. Their voices remain even now. In stone still standing, in brooches unearthed, in ship prows preserved. To run one's hand along the grooves of a Viking carving is to touch 1,000 years of patience, to feel the rhythm of hands long gone, to hear voices not in sound but in shape. Picture such a moment. It is twilight in a Viking village. A man sits near the hearth, carving a small piece of wood. His knife moves slowly, patiently, tracing curves of a serpent that winds endlessly. His daughter watches, her eyes wide, holding a comb he carved the day before. Outside, the sky glows pale, the fields quiet inside. The carving takes form line by line, silence by silence. It is not grand, not famous, but it will last. The art of the Vikings was not about display or spectacle. It was about presence, about carrying beauty in small things, about giving memory to wood and stone, about tracing the rhythm of life in endless knots. It was art for living, art for remembering, art for enduring. And so, as we picture them tonight, we do not see warriors upon waves or raiders upon shores. We see carvers at work, knives steady, hands patient. We see beams and brooches, rune stones and prows, each alive with patterns. We hear silence, filled with meaning. We feel stories, told not in shouts, but in lines carved into wood, into stone, into memory. This was Viking art. Quiet stories, eternal and enduring, woven into every part of life. For all the wood they carved and the stones they raised, perhaps nothing carried the Viking spirit more softly, more enduringly, than their sagas. These were stories told in halls, whispered by hearths, carried on lips from one generation to the next. They were not shouted. They were spoken with patience, their rhythm slow, their voices calm, their words flowing like rivers. They told of voyages and battles, of love and feuds, of gods and men. They were not only entertainment, but memory threads that bound the past to the present, that kept names alive, that gave shape to lives long gone. The sagas were born not from books, but from voices. For centuries, they were not written, but recited, in longhouses warmed by fire, in gatherings at feasts, in quiet evenings of winter. The skalds, the poets spoke. Their words carried cadence, like oars dipping, like waves rolling. Each phrase was measured, each pause deliberate. Those who listened remembered, repeating later what they had heard, adding, shaping, preserving. Memory was fragile, yet strong. The saga was alive not in ink but in people. It was only later, in Iceland, after the Vikings had long settled, that sagas were written down. In the 12th and 13th centuries, monks and scribes, using vellum and ink, recorded what had been spoken for generations. Thus were preserved the Icelandic sagas, tales of families, of voyages, of feuds and reconciliations. These texts survive still, fragile pages carrying voices 1,000 years old. The sagas tell many kinds of stories. Some recall the gods, the Eddas, rich with myths of Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, and the end of days, Ragnarok. Others tell of heroes like Egil Skallagrimsson, fierce warrior and poet, whose deeds filled both battlefields and verses. Others still tell of families, the sagas of Icelanders, where farmers feud, neighbors quarrel, kinship binds and breaks. In these tales, there are no grand kings or empires, only people, living lives filled with both struggle and endurance. The beauty of the sagas lies not in drama, but in detail. They tell us how a hall was built, how a feast was held, how a man sowed his field, how a woman wove her cloth. They speak of daily life with the same care as battles. They remind us that history is not only made in noise, but also in quiet. They preserve not only names of great men, but voices of women, of children, of farmers, of wanderers. Imagine a winter night in Iceland, centuries ago. Snow lies deep outside, wind howls across turf roofs. Inside the longhouse, the hearth glows warmly. Families gather close, cloaks drawn, children curled in furs. A skald begins to speak. His voice is low, steady, carrying through the hall. Tells of voyages across seas, of men rowing in mist, of women tending hearths, of feasts and battles, of gods walking among mortals. The listeners lean closer, their eyes bright, their thoughts carried far. Time itself seems to slow, the words stretching across years, binding past and present in one. The saga is more than story, it is memory. To speak was to remember, to keep alive what otherwise might fade. In a world without paper, the saga was the book of the people, carried not in libraries but in hearts. Children learned by listening, repeating, retelling. Each generation added, shaped, preserved. Through this, names endured. Lives, otherwise forgotten, were carried like embers through centuries. Even when written down, the sagas kept their quiet rhythm. They were copied slowly, patiently, by hands in monasteries, their words flowing in ink across vellum. They remain not only literature, but heritage. Today, when we read them, we hear not only the words, but the voices behind them. Farmers by hearths, skalds in halls, elders speaking to children. We hear the quiet voices of memory. And so, as we imagine them tonight, we do not see battles raging or sails swelling. We see a hall in winter, a fire glowing, voices murmuring. We see children leaning close, women spinning wool, men resting after labor. We hear a saga spoken, its rhythm slow, its words steady, its memory alive. The saga is not only story, it is life itself, remembered in silence, preserved in voice, carried like a flame across time. The world of the Vikings was long guided by the old god Odin's wisdom. Thor's hammer, Freya's love, Freyr's harvest. Their myths lived in sagas, their names whispered in prayers, their presence felt in wind, water, and fire. Yet over time, another faith began to spread into their fjords and valleys, carried first by strangers, then by neighbors, and at last by their own kings. This was the coming of Christianity. Not in a single moment, not in a sudden wave, but slowly, gently, like the tide upon a shore. At first, it came with traders and monks. From England, from Francia, from Germany, missionaries traveled north, their cloaks heavy, their crosses plain, their voices calm. They carried with them books filled with letters the Vikings did not know, songs the Vikings had never heard, stories of one God, of Christ, of saints and martyrs. They spoke of salvation, of heaven, of forgiveness. To many, their words were strange, yet some listened, curious, thoughtful. At times, it came with conquest. Kings in the south demanded baptism in exchange for peace, for trade, for alliance. Warriors taken captive in raids sometimes returned with new faith, their voices carrying prayers instead of sagas. Silver coins bore crosses. Merchants swore oaths upon Christ rather than Thor. Slowly, the presence grew. The sagas remember moments of change, a king choosing baptism, sometimes after visions, sometimes after politics. Olaf Tryggvason, Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, brought Christianity with fire and sword, but also with law and persuasion. In Iceland, the decision was made at the Althing, where chieftains debated beneath open sky. To keep peace, they agreed all would follow Christ, though the old ways might still linger in private. It was not a thunderclap, but a quiet turning, slow and steady. The change was not only in faith, but in sound and sight. Where once groves and stones had been sacred, churches rose small at first, built of timber, their roofs steep, their walls plain. Inside, candles burned, crosses hung, voices sang hymns in soft Latin, unfamiliar yet soothing. Bells rang across valleys, their tones echoing through fjords, calling families to gather. The sound was new, yet in its rhythm, it matched the Viking soul, slow, steady, enduring. The old ways did not vanish at once. Farmers still whispered to Freyr when sowing barley, sailors still cast bread to Ran before voyages, women still spun charms into wool. The gods lingered in memory, in stories, in silence. But over time, crosses replaced hammers around necks. Baptism replaced naming rituals. Burials shifted from ship mounds to churchyards. Slowly, patiently, a new rhythm took hold. Imagine such a moment, a small Viking village at dawn. Mist rises from a fjord, the air cool, the grass wet with dew. A wooden church stands at the edge of the settlement, its bell ringing softly, echoing against cliffs. Families walk slowly toward it, their cloaks drawn, children holding hands. Some still carry small charms hidden in pockets. Some still whisper, two old gods in silence, but their steps lead them toward the church. Inside, candles flicker, voices murmur prayers, wood creaks as benches fill. The old and the new meet in quiet harmony. In longhouses, sagas continued to be told, but new stories joined them, stories of Christ, of saints, of miracles. Runes still carved memory, but now crosses adorned stones. Feasts still filled halls, but prayers began before meals. Slowly, identity shifted, yet in many ways, life remained the same. Farming, fishing, voyaging, carving. The gods may have changed, but the rhythm of patience endured. Christianity brought with it not only faith, but connection. The Vikings, once seen as strangers, became part of Christendom. Their trade grew, their alliances deepened, their names entered chronicles of Europe. They were no longer only raiders from the north, but kings, rulers, neighbors. The bell bound, then not only to fjords, but to a wider world. The transition was not without tension. Some resisted, clinging to old gods. Some fought, some refused. Yet time wore gently upon belief, shaping it not with thunder, but with silence, with habit, with children born into new ways. By the 12th century, Scandinavia was firmly Christian. Its churches rising across valleys, its bells echoing in fjords. But beneath, in sagas and in memory, the old gods lived on, softened, remembered in story rather than prayer. And so, as we imagine them tonight, we do not hear the clash of faiths, nor the fire of conquest. We hear a bell ringing softly at dawn, its sound carrying through mist. We see families walking slowly, their faces calm, their steps steady. We feel the weight of change, not in suddenness, but in patience. The fjords hold silence, the bell holds rhythm, the people hold both past and future. It is the coming of Christianity, quiet, enduring, woven into the northern skies. Every age has its dawn and its dusk. The Viking Age, born in sails and oars upon misty seas, ended not with thunder, but with silence, gradual, patient, inevitable. Its beginning had been marked by sudden raids, by dragon-prowed ships appearing without warning upon foreign shores. Its middle had been filled with voyages across oceans, settlements upon distant lands, trade stretching from the Baltic to Byzantium. Yet its end was slower, less dramatic. It was a fading more than a fall, a settling more than a collapse. By the 11th century, the world was changing. The Vikings had raided monasteries in England, sailed rivers of Francia, fought kings in Ireland. Yet those lands grew stronger, their defenses firmer. England, once fractured, united under kings like Alfred and his heirs. France, once vulnerable, formed fortresses, stone castles rising upon hills. Armies grew larger, rulers grew more organized. The surprise of the Vikings, once their greatest strength, became harder to wield. Shores were guarded, rivers blocked, harbors watched. At the same time, within Scandinavia itself, kingdoms formed. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, once loose chieftaincies and scattered clans, grew into stronger monarchies. Kings demanded loyalty, raised armies, built churches. Freedom of small raiding bands gave way to order, to law, to unity. The same energy that had carried ships outward was now turned inward, binding the North into nations. Christianity also shaped the end. With its spread came not only faith, but connection to Europe. The Vikings, once outsiders, became part of Christendom. They were no longer feared raiders beyond borders, but rulers within them. Their children were baptized, their marriages blessed in churches, their dead buried in consecrated ground. Crosses replaced hammers around necks, bells replaced oaths at stones. The world of Odin and Thor gave way to the world of Christ, not in sudden silence, but in slow blending. Economy too shifted. Trade became steadier, more rooted in towns rather than voyages. Markets grew in Hedeby, Birka, Dublin, York. Craftsmen made goods not only for export, but for neighbors. Farmers produced not only for survival, but for sale. Silver still flowed, but less from plunder and more from commerce. The longships, once engines of fear, became engines of trade. Their sails still swelling, but their journeys quieter. And so, the Viking Age faded. Some say it ended with the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when King Harald Hardrada of Norway fell in England, his dream of conquest undone. Just weeks later, William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Viking settlers, in Normandy, won at Hastings, forever changing England. In those battles, one can see both the end and the legacy. The Vikings no longer raiding, but their descendants shaping kingdoms. Yet truly the end was not a single battle, but a slow settling. The longships still sailed, but fewer with warriors, more with merchants. The halls still glowed, but with prayers as well as sagas. The fjords still echoed, but with bells as well as horns. The Vikings did not vanish, they became part of Europe, woven into its kingdoms, its faith, its trade. Their age as raiders ended, but their age as people continued. Imagine a Viking village in the 12th century. The sea still glitters, ships still rest upon shore, but their sails are patched with trade, not war. A church stands beside a hall, its bell ringing softly, its cross shining faintly in sun. Children chase one another across grass, their laughter, no different from centuries before. A man sharpens a plow, not a sword. A woman spins wool, her spindle turning as always. An elder tells stories not only of Odin and Thor, but also of saints and Christ. Life continues, steady, quiet, enduring. The Viking Age ended not because the sea no longer called, nor because courage faded, but because the world changed, and they changed with it. They became kings instead of raiders, farmers instead of wanderers, traders instead of pillagers. The sails still rose, but the silence they carried was different, less of fear, more of peace. And so, as we close their story tonight, we do not hear axes clash or sails snap. We hear a bell in a fjord village, the child's laughter, a skald's voice fading into silence. We see a ship resting upon shore, its prow weathered, its oars stacked. We feel the rhythm of centuries settling, the quiet end of an age that had once seemed boundless. The Viking Age does not fall, it fades, like the last glow of twilight, steady, calm, eternal. The story of the Vikings began with the sound of oars dipping into fjords, and sails swelling against northern winds. For centuries, their journeys carried them outward to England's shores, to France's rivers, to the icy edges of Greenland, even to the quiet forests of Vinland across the ocean. They rowed eastward as well, their ships gliding along silent rivers, reaching golden Byzantium, guarding emperors, carving their presence into the heart of empires. Their world stretched farther than most could dream, carried by wood, by wind, by patience. Yet their lives were not only voyages. Behind each sail was a home, a hall warmed by fire, a family gathered in quiet. Behind each raid was a farm field sown with barley, sheep grazing upon hills, children playing beneath wide skies. Behind each carving of dragon prows and rune stones was a hand steady with care, shaping stories into wood and stone. The Viking world was not only noise and fear, but also silence and endurance. We have wandered through their halls, where hearths glowed against snow and stories flowed like embers. We have walked their markets, where merchants traded amber for silver, wool for wine, voices mingling in many tongues. We have watched their families in quiet moments, women spinning, men carving, children listening to sagas. We have stood beside their assemblies, where law was spoken in slow rhythm, oaths binding lives together. We have listened to their faith, once whispered to old gods beneath trees, and later sung in churches where bells rang softly. We have seen their art, their sagas, their memory threads woven patiently into centuries. And then, like twilight settling over a fjord, their age slowly faded. Long ships rested upon shores, churches rose, kingdoms formed. The hammer gave way to the cross, the raid gave way to trade, the wandering gave way to settling. The Viking Age ended not with collapse, but with quiet transformation. Its people did not vanish, they became farmers, traders, kings, part of Europe, part of the world. Their sails lowered, their oars rested, their voices blended into new rhythms. Imagine now the silence after centuries of voyage. The fjord lies calm, mist drifting above water. Upon the shore rests an old ship, its timbers weathered, its prow softened by time. Children play nearby, their laughter carrying faintly. A church bell rings, its tone echoing through cliffs. The longhouse, a skald speaks a final saga, his voice low, his words slow, his listeners leaning close. Outside, the stars emerge steady, eternal. The Viking world breathes one last time, then settles into memory. This is their legacy, not only in raids sung by foreign chroniclers, not only in silver hoards buried in earth, not only in kingdoms shaped by their descendants, but in the quiet endurance of their lives, in the patience of rowing, in the warmth of hearths, in the steady rhythm of families, in the sagas whispered across centuries. Their age is gone, but their silence remains, timeless, flowing gently beneath history, like waves upon misty seas. And so we end our voyage, not with thunder, but with calm. The sails are lowered, the oars rest, the fire glows faintly, the story drifts into silence. The Vikings remain not as noise in the present, but as whispers in memory, carried softly into the night.